Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world that feels impossibly distant yet shaped everything about the freedoms we enjoy today. Picture this. The year is 1825. A woman wakes up on her wedding day as a full legal person with rights, property, and a future in her own name. By sunset, after speaking two simple words at the altar, she ceases to exist in the eyes of the law. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. The law declares her legal existence suspended, absorbed, erased. She becomes invisible. This was not a nightmare. This was marriage in early 1800s America, and the doctrine that made it possible had a deceptively gentle name, coverture. So, before we explore this story together, I want to ask something of you. If this journey resonates with you, if what I share tonight moves you or teaches you something new, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video. And I am genuinely curious about where you are right now and when you started watching. Are you settling in for the night in California? Waking up to a quiet morning in London? Share with me in the comments. I truly love hearing from you. Now, let the lights around you soften. Maybe turn on a gentle fan or some soft background sound. Get comfortable, because tonight's story requires us to step back into a world where half the population lived under a legal shadow so complete it is almost unimaginable to us now. Let us talk about what coverture actually meant. In 1765, a British judge named William Blackstone published a book that would shape American law for more than a century. In his commentaries on the laws of England, he wrote these chilling words: "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law." That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband. Read that again slowly in your mind. The very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended. Blackstone was not creating something new, he was simply writing down what had been practiced for centuries. But by putting it in print, by making it official, he gave this doctrine a permanence that would haunt women for generations. Here is what this meant in practical everyday terms. Before marriage, a woman could own property, she could sign contracts, she could write a will, she could sue someone who wronged her. She was called a femme sole, a woman alone, and she had legal rights. But the moment she married, everything changed. She became a femme covert, a covered woman, and that cover was her husband. The law literally said the husband and wife are one person, and that one person is the husband. Think about that for a moment. Not a partnership, not two people becoming one family, one person, and he is the only one who counts. Every single thing a woman brought into the marriage became her husband's property. The money she had saved, his. The land she inherited from her father, he could use it, profit from it, control it. The wages she earned if she worked outside the home, they went straight into his pocket. She could not keep a single penny of money she earned with her own hands. She could not sign a contract in her own name. She could not sue anyone, even if someone harmed her. She could not be sued, because legally she did not exist as a separate person. If someone wanted to take legal action involving her, they had to sue her husband. She could not write a will without her husband's permission. Even deciding what would happen to her own possessions after her death required his consent. And perhaps most painfully, she had no legal rights to her own children. If a husband decided to send a child away as an apprentice, or to live with relatives, or even to give the child up entirely, the mother had absolutely no say in the matter. The children belonged to him. But here is where it gets even more disturbing. Under coverture, a husband had absolute rights to his wife's body. The law assumed that by marrying, a woman gave permanent consent to sexual relations. There was no such thing as marital rape. that would not be recognized as a crime in most American states until the 1980s. Yes, you heard that correctly, the 1980s. A husband could not beat his wife to death. That was murder, and the law drew a line there. But he could beat her. Courts generally allowed what they called reasonable chastisement. As long as he did not kill her or cause permanent serious injury, a man's physical discipline of his wife was considered a private family matter. Now you might be thinking surely there were some protections, some way for a woman to survive this legal disappearing act? There were a few small lifelines, though calling them protections feels generous. One was called the doctrine of necessities. A married woman had the right to be maintained in a manner appropriate to her husband's social class. If he refused to support her, she could go to court and the judge would order him to provide for her. While waiting for the court's decision, she was allowed to buy necessities at local shops, and her husband had to pay those bills. But here is the cruel limitation. The courts could not stop a husband from gambling away the family fortune. They could not prevent him from making terrible business decisions. They could not protect her from his financial ruin. And if creditors came after him for debts, the wife was entitled to keep only the absolute bare minimum. Usually that meant 2 dresses, so she would have one to wear while washing the other, some cooking utensils and a bed. That was it. That was all the law guaranteed her. Let me tell you a real story that captures just how powerfully coverture controlled women's lives. In 1837, in Mississippi, a Chickasaw woman named Betsy Love Allen stood before the state Supreme Court. Betsy had inherited enslaved people from her parents. Following Chickasaw tradition, she and her white husband, James Allen, kept her property separate from his. This was normal in her culture. Women could own property independently, but then James lost a court case and was ordered to surrender all his personal property to pay the judgment. When government officials came to collect, they did not just take his belongings, they also seized the enslaved people who belonged to Betsy. Their reasoning? Under United States law, anything a wife brought to a marriage became the property of her husband. Therefore, the enslaved people Betsy inherited were actually her husband's property and could be taken to pay his debts. Betsy fought back. She sued, arguing that she had the right to follow the customs of her own people. Her case went all the way to the Mississippi Supreme Court, and she won. The court ruled in 1837 that Betsy Love Allen had the right to maintain her property separately from her husband, according to Chickasaw tradition. If an indigenous woman could protect her property from her husband's debts, the court reasoned, then why should white women not have the same protection? 2 years later, in 1839, Mississippi became the first state to pass a Married Women's Property Act. The law said a married woman could own property in her own name, and her husband's creditors could not take it to pay his debts. It was a revolutionary moment. But notice the limitation. A woman could own property, but she still could not control it or sell it without her husband's consent. It was a crack in the wall of coverture, not a breaking down of the wall itself. Other states began to follow Mississippi's example, but progress was agonizingly slow. In 1848, New York passed a more comprehensive Married Women's Property Act that became a model for other states. But even then, courts interpreted these laws as narrowly as possible. As late as 1867, an Illinois court declared, "It is simply impossible that a married woman should be able to control and enjoy her property as if she were sole, without practically leaving her at liberty to annul the marriage." Think about what that statement reveals. The judges believed that if a woman could control her own property, the entire concept of marriage would collapse. The system was so dependent on women's legal non-existence that any crack in that foundation felt like a threat to civilization itself. The irony is almost unbearable. William Blackstone codified coverture in the 1760s right in the middle of the Enlightenment. That great age when philosophers were declaring that all people possessed natural rights simply by being human. John Locke wrote about life, liberty, and property. Thomas Jefferson declared all men are created equal. But somehow women did not count. Marriage did not elevate a woman, it erased her. Abigail Adams understood this. In 1776, when her husband John Adams was helping write the rules for the new American nation, she wrote him a famous letter. Remember the ladies, she urged him. But she was not asking for the right to vote or what we would call equal rights today. She was asking for protection from coverture. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands, she wrote. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. John Adams thought she was joking. He called her letter saucy. But in private correspondence with other founders, he admitted he was worried. If women could argue they deserved rights independent of their husbands, what would stop other groups from demanding the same? And so when the United States Constitution was written, it said nothing about women's rights. The founders left that question to individual states, and state after state chose to keep coverture alive. You might wonder how this affected different women differently. The answer is, devastatingly across all lines, but in different ways. Wealthy women sometimes benefited from marriage settlements, special contracts drawn up before the wedding that set aside certain properties, usually land, for the wife's use. A trustee, often the bride's father or brother, would manage these properties. But such arrangements were rare and even illegal in some states. For enslaved women, coverture was layered on top of their status as property themselves. They had no rights at all, could not marry legally, and their children could be sold away at any moment. For free black women, the situation was complex. On paper, their legal status was similar to white women's, but racial prejudice and the constant threat of being kidnapped into slavery made their lives far more precarious. For poor women and immigrant women, coverture meant that any wages they desperately needed to earn went straight to their husbands. A woman could work 14 hours a day in a factory or taking in laundry, and she had no legal right to a single penny of what she earned. Coverture did not fully end with those early property acts. Remnants persisted well into the 20th century. Women could not serve on juries in most states until the 1960s. Marital rape was not a crime until the 1980s. And even today there are echoes. When a woman changes her name at marriage, that is a distant echo of coverture, of being covered by her husband's identity. When real estate agents assume a husband will be the primary decision maker. When tax law treats married couples in ways that sometimes disadvantage the woman's earnings. These are the ghosts of a legal system that once declared women legally invisible. Understanding coverture matters because it helps us see that the rights women have today are not ancient or natural or obvious. They were fought for, inch by painful inch, by women who refuse to accept invisibility. And here is what strikes me most powerfully. The women living under coverture in the early 1800s did not have the benefit of hindsight. They could not see the progress that was coming. They woke up every day in a world that told them they did not fully exist, and yet they persisted. They found ways to survive, to support their families, to create meaning in their lives, even within a system designed to erase them. That resilience, that quiet, determined refusal to be erased, that is the foundation everything else was built on. Tomorrow we will walk through a single day in the life of an early 1800 woman, and you will see just how much labour, how much endurance, how much sheer physical strength was required just to keep a household running. The legal invisibility was only part of the story. The work was another kind of prison entirely. Sleep well tonight, and I will see you again soon. The clock has not yet struck 5 in the morning and Sarah is already awake. Not because she wants to be, not because she has chosen this life, but because if she does not rise now in the darkness before dawn, her family will not eat today. The fire will not be lit. The water will not be hauled. The endless cycle of work that defines her existence will fall behind, and there is no catching up. This is what a single day looked like for a woman in early 1800s America. And I need you to understand something right from the start. When we talk about 16 to 18-hour workdays, we are not talking about sitting at a desk. We are not talking about meetings or emails or mental fatigue. We are talking about physical labor so brutal, so unrelenting that it would break most of us within a week. Let me walk you through Sarah's day. She is a composite, yes, but every detail I'm about to share comes from actual historical records, diaries, and household manuals from the period. Sarah represents millions of women whose days looked almost exactly like this. 4:30 in the morning. Sarah's feet hit the cold floor. There is no time to ease into the day, no moment of quiet contemplation with coffee. The first task is fire. Without fire, nothing else is possible. No cooking, no warmth, no hot water for washing. She walks to the fireplace, and if the embers from last night have survived, she is lucky. She carefully feeds them kindling, blows gently to coax them back to life, adds larger pieces of wood. If the embers died overnight, she must start from scratch with flint and steel, striking again and again until a spark catches. This alone can take 20 minutes. But here is what most people do not realize. That fire is not like turning on a stove. It must be constantly maintained throughout the entire day. It must be fed, monitored, adjusted. Too hot and you burn the food, too cool and nothing cooks. A woman in 1825 spent on average 3 to 4 hours every single day just managing fire. Now Sarah needs water. And this is where the day's brutality really begins. If Sarah lives in a town, she might have a well in her yard or a public pump a few houses away. If she lives in the country, the well could be a quarter-mile from the house. Either way, she is about to carry somewhere between 30 and 50 gallons of water into her home. By hand, in buckets. Think about that for a moment. A gallon of water weighs about 8 pounds. 50 gallons is 400 pounds of water. And she has to carry it, bucket by bucket, probably 2 gallons at a time if she is strong, which means at minimum 25 trips from the well to the house. This is before breakfast. This is before her children wake up. This is just to have enough water for cooking, cleaning, and washing for the day. A diary entry from 1847, written by a farmer's wife in Ohio, says simply, "Rose before dawn, fetched water. My back aches so fierce I can scarce stand upright. But the day has only begun. By 6 in the morning, Sarah is cooking breakfast. And when I say cooking from scratch, I mean from absolute scratch. There is no box of cereal, no carton of milk delivered to the door, no eggs from the grocery store. If she wants eggs, she has likely already been to the chicken coop, competing with roosters in the dark, reaching under irritated hens. If she wants milk, she or her husband milked the cow at dawn. If she wants bread, she baked it yesterday, or the day before, because bread baking is an all-day process that she rotates through her week. Breakfast might be porridge made from corn she ground herself or from grain she took to the miller. It might be salt pork from the pig they slaughtered last autumn. It might be potatoes stored in the cellar. Everything on that table required hours of labour before it ever reached a plate. Her husband eats, her children eat. Sarah probably eats standing up in between serving everyone else, because there is too much to do to sit down. 7 in the morning, the breakfast dishes must be washed. But remember, there is no running water. She must heat water over the fire, scrub each dish by hand, dry them, put them away. Then she must deal with the scraps. Food waste goes to the pigs or the compost. Nothing is wasted because everything is too precious. Now comes the work that defines her day. and it changes depending on what day of the week it is. Because women in the early 1800s organised their labour around a rigid weekly schedule. Monday was washing day, Tuesday was ironing, Wednesday was mending, Thursday was churning butter and making cheese, Friday was cleaning, Saturday was baking, Sunday was the Lord's Day, which theoretically meant rest but actually meant cooking a large meal and hosting family. Let us say today is Tuesday, ironing day. You might think, how hard can ironing be? Let me tell you exactly how hard. Sarah heats her sad iron on the stove. These irons weigh between 4 and 6 pounds. Solid metal, no temperature control. She tests it by spitting on it. If the spit sizzles and evaporates instantly, the iron is ready. Too hot and it will scorch the fabric, too cool and it will not smooth the wrinkles. She places a thick cloth on the table to protect the wood. She sprinkles water on the first garment, usually a shirt her husband will wear to church. She presses the hot iron down and begins moving it across the fabric. The heat radiates up into her face. The weight pulls on her shoulders, and she must work quickly because the iron cools fast. When it cools too much to be effective, she returns it to the fire and picks up the second iron which has been heating while she worked. Back and forth. Hot iron, cool iron, hot iron, cool as hell iron. For hours. A family of 6 might have 30 items that need ironing each week. Shirts, petticoats, aprons, handkerchiefs, children's clothes. Each item takes time. By the end of the day, Sarah's shoulders burn. Her hands are marked with small burns from careless moments. Her back screams from bending over the ironing board. And here is something that breaks my heart. While she is doing this exhausting work, she is also supposed to be watching the children. In 1825, families averaged 5 to 6 children. Sarah might have a baby on her hip while she irons. Toddlers playing at her feet, older children given tasks like sweeping or fetching wood, but still requiring supervision. There is no such thing as focused work time. Everything happens simultaneously. Cook, clean, watch the children, manage the fire, listen for the baby, stop a fight between the toddlers, stir the soup, add wood to the fire, check on the bread, wipe a nose, change a diaper. A woman named Catherine Beecher wrote a household management book in 1841. She calculated that an average housewife walked between 8 and 10 miles per day just moving around inside and near her home. 8 to 10 miles, every single day, while carrying children, water, wood, laundry and food. Midday arrives and Sarah must prepare the main meal. This is not sandwiches, this is a full-cooked dinner. Meat if they can afford it. Vegetables from the garden that she planted, weeded and harvested herself. Bread. Perhaps a pie. The cooking happens over an open hearth or, if the family is more prosperous, a cast iron stove. There are no timers, no thermometers. Everything is done by experience, by watching, by testing. A skilled cook can tell the temperature of her oven by how long she can hold her hand inside it. 5 seconds, hot enough for bread. 3 seconds, perfect for a pie. After dinner, more dishes, more cleaning, more water hauled and heated and used and disposed of. The afternoon brings whatever task did not get finished in the morning, plus new emergencies. A child has torn their stockings and needs mending. The garden needs weeding or the vegetables will be choked out. Apples need to be peeled and preserved before they rot. The chicken coop needs cleaning. If Sarah lives on a farm, she may also be expected to help with outdoor work during harvest time. Planting season, butchering, making soap from rendered fat and lye. Candle making, preserving meat for winter. Do you know how women made soap in 1825? They saved all the wood ash from the fireplace in a barrel. They poured water through it to create lye water, which is caustic enough to burn skin. Then they rendered animal fat, which means boiling down the fatty parts of butchered animals until they liquefied. Then they combined the lye water and melted fat in a huge pot and boiled it for hours, stirring constantly until it thickened into soap. This process took an entire day, and it had to be done several times a year to keep the family supplied with soap for washing clothes, dishes, and bodies. Evening comes. Around 5 or 6 in the afternoon, Sarah begins preparing supper. This is usually simpler than the midday meal, often leftovers or something quick like cornmeal mush. But it still requires fire management, cooking, serving, and cleaning. After supper, there is mending by candlelight, sewing, knitting. A woman's hands are never idle. Clothes wore out quickly with such hard use, and everything had to be mended, patched, repatched, and finally turned into rags for cleaning. If there is a baby, Sarah is nursing throughout all of this. Babies in this era typically nursed for 2 years, so while she is cooking, she might be nursing. While she is ironing, she might be nursing. Her body is not her own. It is a food source, a comfort source constantly demanded. Around 9 or 10 at night, Sarah finally banks the fire for the night, covering the coals with ash so they will last until morning. She collapses into bed. Her hands are cracked and rough. Her back aches. Her feet are swollen. She has been awake and working for 17 hours, and she will rise in about 6 hours to do it all again. Now, you might be wondering, did all women experience this exact same routine? The answer is no, but the differences tell us important things about class and race in early America. Wealthy women in cities had servants to do much of this labor, but managing servants was itself considered a full-time job. A wealthy woman was expected to plan menus, manage budgets, train servants, and maintain social obligations. Her labor was mental and social rather than physical, but it was still labor, and she was still legally invisible under coverture. Poor women and immigrant women often worked outside the home in addition to maintaining their own households. They might take in laundry from wealthy families, or work in early factories for 12-hour shifts, then come home and do all their own household work as well. Enslaved women faced the most brutal reality of all. They did all this household labor for their enslavers' families, then had to somehow find time and energy to care for their own families as well. And they had no legal rights to their own children, who could be sold away at any moment. Free black women often worked as laundresses or domestic servants, doing other people's household labor for pay, then going home to do their own. The intersections of race, class, and gender created vastly different experiences, but all women faced the reality that domestic labor was invisible, uncompensated, and never-ending. Here is what strikes me most about this daily marathon. It was not valued. A husband could complain that his wife had not accomplished enough in a day. Society could criticize a woman for keeping a messy house or serving a poor meal, but no one counted this as real work. No one calculated its economic value. A woman's labor kept her family alive, clothed, fed, and clean. But it was seen as her natural duty, not as work deserving recognition or compensation. And remember, all those wages Sarah might earn taking in extra laundry or sewing, those legally belonged to her husband under coverture. She could work herself into exhaustion and still have no money of her own. I want you to imagine living this life, not for a day, not for a week, but for 40 or 50 years, from the time you marry as a teenager until your body finally gives out. The same tasks day after day, year after year, the endless physical labor, the constant demands, never a day off, never a vacation, never a moment when someone says, "You've done enough, rest now." That was the reality for millions of women, and they survived it. They found moments of joy in their children's laughter. They found community with other women. They found pride in a well-kept home or a perfectly baked loaf of bread. They sang while they worked. They told stories. They created beauty in small ways, embroidering a pillowcase or planting flowers by the door. But the cost was enormous. Bodies worn out by age 40, hands permanently scarred from burns and rough work, backs bent from decades of hauling water and bending over wash tubs, and always, the knowledge that this labour was invisible, uncounted, unvalued by the society they served so faithfully. Now that you understand the physical prison of daily labour, we need to talk about the one task women dreaded more than any other. The task that took 2 full days every single week. The task that left them so exhausted they could barely stand. Monday's work was legendary in its brutality, and we're going to explore every back-breaking detail of Laundry Day next. There is a reason women in early 1800s America called it Blue Monday, and it had nothing to do with feeling sad about the weekend ending. Monday was wash day, and it was universally, absolutely, completely dreaded. In 1867, a woman named Rachel Haskell wrote in her diary, "Today is the Herculean task which women all dread." Another entry simply says, "the great domestic dread of the household." These were not dramatic exaggerations. Laundry day was genuinely the most physically exhausting work a woman did all week. And I am going to walk you through every single step so you understand exactly why. But first, let me give you some perspective. In our modern world, doing laundry means tossing clothes into a machine, adding detergent, pressing a button, and walking away. The entire process from dirty to clean and dry takes maybe 3 hours, and we're only actively involved for about 5 minutes of that time. In 1825, laundry was a 2-day process that required the physical strength of a farm labourer and the endurance of a marathon runner. Most household guides recommended that families do laundry every single week. For a family of 6 to 8 people, this meant washing, drying and ironing somewhere between 50 and 100 items every single week. Let me take you through what actually happened step by step. And I want you to imagine yourself doing this. Really picture it. Because the physicality of this work is almost impossible for us to grasp otherwise. The work actually began on Saturday. Yes, Saturday. Because clothes that were extremely dirty needed to be soaked for 2 full days before washing. A woman would sort through the dirty laundry, separating the whites from the coloured items, the heavily soiled work clothes from the lighter garments. Anything with serious stains got pre-treated and put into a tub of lukewarm, soapy water to soak. Then came Sunday, the Sabbath, supposedly a day of rest, but the laundry was soaking and that was work even if you were just monitoring it. Monday morning arrived at 4 o'clock, yes, 4 in the morning, because laundry day could easily stretch to 14 or 16 hours, and a woman had to start in darkness to have any hope of finishing before nightfall. The very first task was fire. Not just a cooking fire, but a massive fire capable of boiling dozens of gallons of water for hours. A woman would need to chop or gather an enormous amount of firewood. One household manual from 1850 estimated that a typical wash day required fuel equivalent to about 50 pounds of wood. If her husband or children could gather the wood, she was fortunate. If not, this was another task she did herself in the pre-dawn darkness, swinging an axe or dragging fallen branches from the woods. Next came the water. Oh, the water. Remember how I told you that a woman typically hauled 30 to 50 gallons of water per day? On wash day, that number more than doubled. A large family wash could require 100 gallons of water or more. 100 gallons. That is 800 pounds of water. Carried bucket by bucket from the well. Think about that for a moment. Have you ever carried 2 full buckets of water even a short distance? Your arms burn within minutes. Your shoulders scream. Now imagine doing that 50 times. before breakfast, before the actual washing even begins. Many women did this work while pregnant, or while nursing a baby, or both. The water had to be heated in large kettles or boilers over the fire. This took hours. While waiting for the water to heat, a woman might work on the next crucial element: soap. If a family could afford to buy soap, they were fortunate. By the late 1800s, commercially made soap became more available. But in the early part of the century, most women made their own. Here is how you made soap in 1825. First, you saved all the wood ashes from your fireplace in a barrel with a small hole in the bottom. You poured water through the ashes and collected the liquid that dripped out the bottom. This liquid was lye water, and it was caustic enough to burn your skin if you were not careful. Then you took all the fat you had saved from butchering animals, beef tallow or pork lard, and you rendered it by cutting it into small pieces and heating it slowly until it melted into liquid fat. Then you combined the lye water and the melted fat in a huge iron pot and boiled it for hours, stirring constantly with a long wooden stick, until the mixture thickened and turned into soap. This was not a quick process. Making enough soap for the year might take several full days of work. The soap was then poured into moulds and left to harden. Once hardened, it was cut into bars and stored. This soap was harsh. Very harsh. It could strip the skin off your hands if you used it without protection, but it was what women had to work with. So, Monday morning, fire roaring, water heating, soap ready, now the actual washing could begin. The process had specific steps, and every household manual of the era described roughly the same procedure. Let me walk you through it. Step 1. Fill the wash tub with hot water and add soap. Take the first batch of clothing, usually the whites, and submerge them in the hot soapy water. Let them soak for a few minutes to loosen the dirt. Step 2. Scrub each item individually on a washboard. Do you know what a washboard is? It is a wooden frame with a metal or glass ridged surface. You lay the wet, soapy garment across the ridges and scrub it up and down, using the friction to force the dirt out of the fabric. This is back-breaking work. You are bent over a tub, your hands submerged in water so hot it turns them red and raw. You are using your full body weight to press down and scrub. Your knuckles scrape against the metal ridges. Your back screams from the bent position. Every single item had to be scrubbed this way. Shirts, dresses, undergarments, sheets, towels, stockings, handkerchiefs, each one individually washed on both sides. Step 3. Wring out the excess water. Before washing machines with spin cycles, this meant twisting the fabric with your bare hands, wringing it as hard as you possibly could to squeeze out the dirty water. Wringing wet sheets required 2 people, one on each end, twisting in opposite directions. The clothes wringer was not invented until the 1880s, and even then it had to be cranked by hand. Before that, pure muscle power. Step 4. Boil the clothes. Yes, boil them. The cleanest wash required that white items be boiled in soapy water to kill germs and remove any remaining stains. Women would transfer the scrubbed, wrung-out whites into a large copper boiler or iron kettle filled with boiling soapy water. Then she would use a long wooden stick, called a dolly stick or battling stick, to stir and agitate the clothes in the boiling water. This went on for 30 minutes to an hour, standing over a kettle of boiling water in a hot kitchen, stirring constantly. Imagine doing this in July, in August, when the temperature outside is already 90 degrees, and now you are standing over a massive pot of boiling water, steam rising into your face for an hour. Women fainted, not occasionally, regularly. The combination of heat, physical exertion, and often poor nutrition meant that laundry day was genuinely dangerous. Step 5. Rinse. The boiled clothes had to be removed from the boiling water with the stick, allowed to cool slightly, then rinsed in clean water to remove all the soap. This usually required at least 2 rinse waters. Clean water that also had to be hauled, heated to warm, and then disposed of after use. Step 6. Bluing. White fabrics naturally yellowed over time and with repeated washing. To counteract this, women used a product called bluing, a blue dye that made the fabric appear whiter. The rinsed white clothes would be dipped in a tub of water mixed with bluing, then wrung out again. Step 7. Stitching. Many items needed to be starched for that crisp, proper appearance. Collars, cuffs, petticoats, aprons. Starch was made by mixing starch powder with water and heating it until it thickened. The clean rinsed items were dipped in the starch mixture, then wrung out. Step 8. Drying. In good weather, clothes were hung outside on clotheslines, but you could not just throw them over the line any old way. Items had to be shaken out, smoothed, and hung carefully to minimize wrinkles. Sheets and large items required 2 people to hang properly. In bad weather, in winter, in rain, clothes had to be dried inside on racks near the fire, which meant the house was draped with damp, steaming laundry for days. A household manual from 1869 noted, "If the weather is poor, a woman may find a house filled with drying laundry for 3 or 4 days following wash day, making all other household activities nearly impossible." And here is something I find particularly cruel. While doing all of this, a woman was also expected to prepare meals for her family. Laundry day did not excuse her from cooking breakfast, dinner, and supper. Somehow, in between hauling water and scrubbing clothes and stirring boiling kettles, she also had to feed everyone. By evening, a woman who'd started at 4 in the morning might finally finish around 7 or 8 at night. 15 or 16 hours of brutal physical labour. Her hands would be wrinkled, raw and burned. Her back would be in agony. Her legs would shake from standing all day, but she was not done. Because Tuesday was ironing day, the clean dry laundry had to be ironed. Everything. And ironing in 1825 was nothing like plugging in an electric iron and gliding it over a shirt. Sad irons, also called flat irons, were solid pieces of metal weighing 4 to 6 pounds each. They had to be heated on the stove until they were hot enough to smooth fabric, but not so hot they would scorch it. A woman typically worked with 2 or 3 irons. While one was being used, the others heated on the stove. Testing the temperature was done by spitting on the iron. If the spit danced across the surface and evaporated quickly, the iron was ready. If it just sat there and sizzled slowly, the iron was too cool. If it evaporated instantly with a sharp hiss, the iron was too hot. The handle of the iron was also metal and got scorching hot. Some irons came with detachable wooden handles. Others required the use of a thick cloth to protect your hand. Burns were common, very common. Ironing a shirt properly could take 20 minutes. The collar had to be done from both sides, the cuffs had to be perfectly crisp. The body of the shirt had to be smooth. A family's entire weekly laundry might take 8 to 10 hours to iron completely. So the 2-day laundry cycle meant roughly 25 to 30 hours of work total, more than a full-time job in modern terms, and this happened every single week. No wonder women called it the Herculean task. There is a story that perfectly captures the burden of laundry. In the late 1800s, when commercial laundries began opening in cities, women flocked to use them. Even poor women, who could barely afford it, would scrimp and save to send at least some of their laundry out to be done professionally. Because finally there was an alternative, and women grabbed it with both raw, work-worn hands. An 1890 article noted, "The first thing a woman does when her family's financial situation improves even slightly is to send the washing out. Before new clothes, before better food, before any other luxury, she wants relief from laundry day." Think about what that tells us. Women would rather keep wearing old, worn clothes and eating simple food than continue doing their own laundry. That is how desperately they wanted escape from this particular torture. But for most of the early 1800s, there was no escape. You did the laundry or your family wore dirty clothes, which was socially unacceptable and could even result in your husband being mocked at work or church. Cleanliness was seen as a moral virtue. A woman who could not keep her family's clothes clean was judged as lazy, slovenly, a poor wife and mother, so women pushed their bodies to the breaking point week after week, year after year to meet this impossible standard. And here is what breaks my heart most. All this work, all this physical suffering was completely invisible. A man might come home on Monday evening, eat the dinner his wife somehow managed to prepare between stirring boiling laundry, and complain that she looked tired or that the house was not as tidy as usual. He had no concept of what she had done that day. Society had no way to measure or value her labour. It was just what women did, natural, expected, unremarkable, except it was remarkable. It was extraordinary. These women had the physical endurance of athletes. They performed feats of strength and stamina that would impress us today. But instead of medals or recognition, they got roughened hands, aching backs, and the expectation that they would do it all again next Monday. Now all of this physical exhaustion, all of this invisible labour existed alongside another reality that was even more terrifying. Because while women were breaking their bodies to keep their families alive, they were also facing a danger that could kill them at any moment. Childbirth in early 1800s. America was not just painful or difficult. It was one of the leading causes of death for women, and the statistics are genuinely shocking. Let me show you just how dangerous it was to be a mother. Imagine knowing that the single most dangerous thing you will ever do in your life is something you are expected to do 6, 7, 8 times or more. Imagine that every time you become pregnant, you are essentially rolling dice with death. And imagine that society tells you this is your sacred duty, your highest calling, the very purpose for which you were created. This was the reality of childbirth in early 1800s America. Let me give you a number that should stop you in your tracks. In the early 1800s, depending on where you lived and whether you gave birth at home or in a hospital, somewhere between 25 and 85 out of every 1,000 women died in childbirth or shortly after. Let me put that in perspective. At the lower end, that is 2.5%. At the higher end, 8.5%. Those numbers might not sound enormous until you remember that women typically gave birth multiple times. The average married woman in 1825 had 5 to 7 children. Some had 10 or more. Here is what that means for lifetime risk. Historians estimate that about 1 in 18 married women died from pregnancy or childbirth complications during their lifetime. 1 in 18. Think about that. Gather 18 of your female friends or family members in a room. Statistically, one of them would have died from having babies. And here is something even more haunting. During the actual birth and the 6 to 8 weeks following it, a woman faced about 6 times her normal risk of death. 6 times. Childbirth was not just dangerous. It was the second leading cause of death for women of childbearing age, right after tuberculosis. But numbers alone cannot capture the terror. Let me tell you what actually happened when a woman went into labour in 1825. First, understand that there was no such thing as a hospital birth for most women. Hospitals existed, yes, but lying in hospitals, as they were called, were primarily for poor women, unwed mothers, or women with nowhere else to go, and their death rates were terrifyingly high, sometimes reaching 85 deaths per 1,000 births. Why? Because these hospitals had no concept of germ theory. Doctors and medical students would go from performing autopsies on dead bodies directly to delivering babies, without washing their hands. They would examine patient after patient with the same unwashed hands, spreading what was called puerperal fever, or childbed fever, which was actually a streptococcal infection. In fact, a doctor's attendance at birth often made things more dangerous, not less, because doctors used instruments like forceps and performed internal examinations far more frequently than midwives did, and they did so without any understanding of sterilization. So most women gave birth at home, attended by a midwife, a female relative, or sometimes a male doctor if the family could afford one and the birth was going poorly. Let me walk you through what a typical birth looked like. When labor began, a woman would send for her midwife or birth attendant. In rural areas, this might mean sending a child or husband on horseback to fetch someone miles away. The woman in labor might wait hours for help to arrive, dealing with contractions alone or with only frightened family members present. The birth took place in the woman's bedroom, or sometimes in a downstairs room where a fire could be kept going. Remember, this is long before central heating. In winter, the room might be freezing except right near the fireplace. In summer, it might be stifling hot. Other women from the community would gather. This was called a lying in, and it was one of the few times when women's community support was formalized and expected. These women would prepare food, care for the laboring woman's other children, change bedding, heat water, and offer emotional support. But they could do very little to actually help with the birth itself. There was no pain medication, none, no epidural, no gas, no morphine, though that would come later in the century. A woman felt every single contraction, every moment of the baby passing through her body in full unmedicated intensity. If the birth was straightforward, a healthy baby might arrive after hours or sometimes days of labor. The midwife would catch the baby, cut the umbilical cord, deliver the placenta, and then monitor the mother for bleeding. But so many things could go wrong, and when they did, there was often nothing anyone could do. Let me tell you about the main killers. First, hemorrhage, massive bleeding during or after birth. This could happen if the placenta did not detach properly from the uterine wall, or if the uterus did not contract back down after delivery, or if there was a tear in the birth canal. Without modern blood transfusions or surgical techniques, a woman could bleed to death in minutes, while her family watched helplessly. One woman's diary from 1849 describes attending a neighbour's birth. The blood came so fast, great gushes of it soaking through the bedding onto the floor. We tried everything we knew, pressing on her belly, cold compresses, but nothing stopped it. She was gone before her husband could even be fetched from the field. Second, puerperal fever, childbed fever. This infection typically began within a few days after birth and spread rapidly. A woman would develop a fever, chills, severe abdominal pain. The infection would spread through her bloodstream. Without antibiotics, which did not exist until the 1930s and 40s, there was no treatment. Women died in agony, often within a week of giving birth to a healthy baby. During the cholera epidemics of 1849 and 1866, death rates spiked even higher. A woman named Samuel Maverick, thought to be the first American woman to establish a permanent home in San Antonio, wrote about the 1849 epidemic. Scores of victims daily went to their death during its 6 weeks visit. Imagine being pregnant during a cholera epidemic. Knowing that your already dangerous childbirth would be even more deadly because disease was running rampant through your community. Third, eclampsia. This is what killed Lady Sybil on Downton Abbey, for those of you who watched that show. It is dangerously high blood pressure during pregnancy that can lead to seizures, organ damage, and death. In the 1800s, there was no way to monitor blood pressure, no medication to control it, and no emergency caesarean section to save mother and baby. A woman with eclampsia would begin having seizures during or after labor. Her family would watch in horror as her body convulsed, knowing there was nothing they could do. Many women died during these seizures. Many babies died too. Fourth, obstructed labour. Sometimes a baby simply could not pass through the birth canal. Perhaps the baby was positioned wrong. Perhaps the mother's pelvis was too small or misshapen from childhood rickets, which was common in malnourished populations. Perhaps the baby was too large. When labour became obstructed and went on too long, terrible things happened. The soft tissues between the birth canal and bladder or rectum could be crushed, creating holes called fistulas that would leak urine or feces for the rest of the woman's life. The baby almost always died in these cases. Sometimes the mother died from infection or exhaustion. Sometimes she survived, but with permanent, devastating injuries. In these desperate situations, doctors might use forceps, metal instruments designed to grip the baby's head and pull, but forceps used before the development of proper technique often caused terrible damage. Crushed skulls, brain injuries, massive tears in the mother's body. One particularly horrifying option was craniotomy, where the doctor would crush the baby's skull to make it small enough to deliver if the baby had already died and could not be delivered otherwise. This was done to save the mother's life, but imagine the trauma. Imagine knowing that your dead baby's body was being deliberately destroyed inside you because it was the only way to save your life. There is a reason women wrote their wills before going into labour. There is a reason they gathered their children around them to say what might be final goodbyes. They knew the odds. A letter from 1835, written by a woman named Elizabeth to her sister the day she went into labour. If you receive this letter without further word from me, know that I faced my confinement with faith in God, but also with clear eyes. I have arranged for the children's care should I not survive. Tell them their mother loved them more than life. Elizabeth survived that birth, but her words show us the mentality. Childbirth was approached with the same solemnity as going into battle, because in a very real sense, it was. Now, you might be thinking, surely women had some choice in this. Surely they could decide not to have so many children. The answer is complicated. Birth control existed, but it was unreliable, often unsafe and deeply controversial. Withdrawal, the rhythm method, prolonged breastfeeding to delay fertility, herbal abortifacients that were often poisonous. These were the options. Condoms existed but were expensive, considered shameful, and not widely available. They were made from animal intestines or, later, from rubber, and they were marketed primarily as protection against venereal disease, not as birth control. More importantly, under coverture, a woman had no legal right to refuse her husband sexual access. Marital rape was not a crime. It was not even a concept that society recognized. A wife's body belonged to her husband, and he had absolute rights to it. So a woman could not legally refuse sex, could not reliably prevent pregnancy, and faced significant risk of death every time she gave birth. This was her reality, and even if she survived the birth, her suffering often continued. Let me tell you about the conditions women endured after childbirth. Puerperal infections, as I mentioned, were common, but there were other issues too. Prolapsed uterus, where the uterus drops down or even protrudes from the vagina due to weakened muscles and ligaments from multiple births, incontinence from damaged pelvic floor muscles, chronic pain from tears that healed poorly or not at all. Fistulas from obstructed labour could leave a woman leaking urine or feces constantly for the rest of her life. There was no surgical repair available. These women became social pariahs, unable to control their own bodies, often abandoned by their communities due to the smell and the shame. Anemia from blood loss and poor nutrition left women weak and exhausted for months after birth. And then they were expected to immediately resume all their household duties plus care for a newborn, while their bodies tried to heal. There was no maternity leave, no recovery period. A woman might give birth on Monday and be expected to cook dinner on Tuesday. One doctor writing in 1850 noted, "It is not uncommon to see a woman rise from childbed after only a few days, return to her full duties of household management and subsequently collapse from exhaustion or infection that might have been prevented by adequate rest." But rest was a luxury most women could not afford. There were other children to care for, a husband to feed, a house to maintain. The work did not stop just because a woman had nearly died, bringing new life into the world. Here is something I find particularly heartbreaking. Women helped each other through this. The lying-in tradition meant that women who had survived childbirth would come to support those currently labouring. They would share knowledge, offer comfort, pray together. They could not prevent the deaths. They could not stop the infections or the hemorrhages, but they could bear witness. They could hold a dying woman's hand. They could care for the motherless children left behind. In many communities there were women known as the Watchers, older women who had attended so many births that they knew all the signs, all the dangers. These women were repositories of hard-won knowledge, passed down mother to daughter, midwife to apprentice. But for all their experience, for all their wisdom, they were working with almost no tools and no scientific understanding of infection or anatomy. They did the best they could with what they had, and what they had was courage, compassion, and presence. Let me tell you one more story, because I think it captures both the horror and the resilience. In San Antonio during the 1850s, there was a woman named Catherine Louise Jacques. She was known as a ministering angel, someone who went to the sick and dying without payment, out of pure charity. During the cholera epidemics, when scores of people were dying daily, she nursed the sick and dying with outstanding courage. She attended births. She closed the eyes of those who did not survive. She cared for the motherless babies and the grief-stricken families. She was called the Mother of the Poor because of her generosity and courage. Women like Catherine existed in every community. Women who had survived their own births, their own losses, and who turned that survival into service. They could not change the statistics. They could not make childbirth safe, but they could make sure no woman died alone. They could make sure someone was there to receive the baby if the mother could not. They could make sure the story was told, the grief was witnessed, the life was mourned. This is what gets me: the survival, the persistence, the decision to keep bringing children into the world despite knowing the risks, the courage it took to face labour knowing you might not survive it, the strength it took to watch your friends and sisters die and then still choose to have another baby yourself. Because what choice did they really have? Marriage was expected, childbearing was the purpose assigned to them, and refusing your husband's advances was not an option. So they faced it. Again and again, some survived all their births, some did not. And every woman who made it through added her survival to the collective knowledge, the collective strength that carried the next generation through. But while women were risking death in childbirth, while they were breaking their bodies with physical labour, society was simultaneously telling them that their true nature was delicate, fragile and weak. The contradictions were stunning, and the ideology that justified it all had a name: the cult of true womanhood. This belief system controlled every aspect of a woman's life, and its rules were as rigid as they were ridiculous. Let me show you exactly what it demanded. Picture a world where piano legs were considered so scandalous that wealthy families dressed them in tiny fabric trousers, where the word leg could not be spoken in polite company, so people said limb instead, where doctors genuinely believed that if a woman read too many books or thought too hard, her brain would overheat and damage her reproductive organs, possibly making her infertile. You think I am exaggerating, don't you? I wish I were. This was the cult of true womanhood. an ideology so pervasive in early 1800s America that it shaped everything from furniture design to medical practice to what words you were allowed to say out loud. And it rested on one central absurd contradiction. Women were simultaneously so pure and virtuous that they were morally superior to men, and so weak and fragile that they could not be trusted with any real power or responsibility. Let me explain how this actually worked, because the specifics are wild. The cult of true womanhood said that a proper woman embodied 4 essential virtues: piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. These were not suggestions, they were requirements for being considered a respectable woman. Let me break down what each one actually meant in practice. First, piety. A true woman was deeply religious, and her religiosity was supposed to be the gentle, emotional, intuitive kind, not the intellectual, theological, questioning kind that would be unfeminine. Women were expected to be the moral guardians of the home, teaching religion to their children, ensuring their husbands attended church, and setting an example of Christian virtue. But here is the catch. They could not preach. They could not be ministers. They could not interpret scripture publicly or make theological arguments. Their religion had to be private, domestic, and most importantly non-threatening to male religious authority. If a woman showed too much interest in theology, too much knowledge of scripture, or heaven forbid disagreed with a minister's interpretation, she was considered prideful and unfeminine. Her place was to receive religious instruction, not to question it. Second, purity. This is where things get truly bizarre. A true woman was supposed to be pure in thought, word, and deed. She was to have no sexual knowledge or desire before marriage. Even after marriage, she was expected to endure her husband's advances as a duty, not to enjoy them. A woman who showed sexual interest or pleasure was considered depraved, possibly insane, certainly not a lady. This obsession with purity extended to language in ways that seem almost comical now. Certain words simply could not be spoken in front of women because they were too indelicate. You could not say leg, you had to say limb. Even referring to a chicken leg at dinner required calling it a drumstick or avoiding mention of it entirely. The word breast was absolutely forbidden. Chicken breast became white meat. Women's undergarments could not be mentioned at all. They were called unmentionables or inexpressibles. And yes, there really were Victorian families so dedicated to this that they covered their piano legs with little fabric skirts because the sight of naked furniture legs was considered provocative. This is documented in multiple etiquette books and household guides from the period. Think about the mental gymnastics required here. Women were hauling water, scrubbing laundry, slaughtering chickens, and dealing with all the messy realities of life. But they were supposed to pretend they were so delicate and pure that they might faint at the mere mention of a leg. Third, submissiveness. A true woman was supposed to defer to male authority in all things. Her father before marriage, her husband after, and really any male authority figure at any time. She was not to argue, not to assert her own opinion strongly, not to make demands. Popular literature of the time is full of advice telling women to yield gracefully to their husbands' wishes, even when they disagreed. One advice book from 1837 counsels, "When your husband comes home irritated or angry, do not meet him with complaints or demands. Soothe him with gentle words and sweet compliance. Your duty is to make home a haven of peace, not a battleground of wills." Another guidebook suggests, "If your husband makes a decision you believe to be unwise, you may gently suggest an alternative once. If he persists in his choice, accept it with grace, and do your utmost to make his plan succeed. A wife who nags or insists on her own way creates discord and proves herself unworthy of her husband's protection. Notice the language there. A woman's worth was measured by her ability to suppress her own judgment and support her husband's decisions even when she knew they were wrong. Fourth, domesticity. A true woman's natural sphere was the home. Her fulfillment came from creating a comfortable, beautiful, morally uplifting domestic space. She was not suited for business, politics, or public life. Those arenas were too harsh, too competitive, too morally corrupting for her delicate nature. A woman who showed ambition beyond her home was considered unnatural. Magazines, sermons, and advice literature constantly reinforced this. Godey's Lady's Book, one of the most popular women's magazines of the era with the circulation reaching 150,000 by 1860, published endless articles about domestic accomplishments, moral improvement, and the sacred duty of motherhood. But here is what I find fascinating. Godey's Lady's Book was edited by a woman named Sarah Josepha Hale, who clearly had ambition and talent beyond the domestic sphere. She was a published author, a magazine editor, a public figure, and yet the magazine she edited constantly promoted the idea that women's place was in the home. This contradiction was everywhere. Women writers published novels and poetry about how women should not seek public attention. Women who ran successful businesses insisted publicly that business was unsuitable for the female temperament. Women who were clearly intelligent and capable promoted the idea that women were intellectually inferior to men. Why? Because to do otherwise was to risk being labelled unfeminine, unwomanly, unnatural. And in a society where a woman's entire social status and survival depended on being seen as respectable, that was too dangerous. Now, here is where the ideology becomes truly constraining. The cult of true womanhood was not just about what women should do. It was about what they were not allowed to do, not allowed to be, not allowed to even think about. A true woman could not be too educated. Education beyond the basics of reading, writing, and domestic skills was considered dangerous. Why? Because as one prominent male physician wrote in 1848, the female brain is smaller and more delicate than the male brain. Excessive study can overheat it, causing nervous exhaustion and potentially damaging the reproductive organs. This was not fringe thinking. This was mainstream medical opinion. Doctors genuinely believed that if a woman spent too much time reading or thinking, the blood flow to her brain would be diverted from her uterus, making her infertile or causing her to miscarry. An 1873 book called Sex in Education, written by a Dr. Edward Clark from Harvard Medical School, argued that allowing women to attend college would destroy their health and their ability to bear children. He presented case studies of young women who supposedly became ill or infertile from too much studying. This book was taken seriously. It was used as evidence against allowing women into higher education for decades. Can you imagine? Being told that learning mathematics or reading philosophy would damage your ovaries? That thinking too hard would make you unfit for your sacred duty of motherhood? A true woman also could not show too much physical strength or capability. Yes, she was expected to haul water and do laundry and all that brutal physical labour we discussed. But she was supposed to do it quietly, without complaining, and certainly without seeming to enjoy physical exertion or develop visible muscles. The ideal female form was supposed to be soft, rounded, delicate. Women who were too strong, too athletic, too physically capable were considered masculine and therefore unattractive and improper. This is why corsets became so important and so dangerous. Women wore corsets that laced so tightly they could barely breathe, all to create that ideal small-waisted silhouette. Medical records from the era document broken ribs, damaged internal organs, difficulty breathing, fainting spells, and even instances of corsets literally deforming women's skeletons over time. One doctor's account from 1867 describes examining a patient. The corset had compressed her ribs to such a degree that her liver was pushed downward and her lungs could not fully expand. She experienced frequent fainting and had developed a chronic cough. When I suggested she discontinue wearing the corset, she was horrified, saying her husband would find her indecent without it. This woman was slowly destroying her internal organs, but the idea of appearing in public without the correct silhouette was more horrifying to her than the physical damage. And here is the cruelest part of the cult of true womanhood. It claimed to elevate women. It said women were more moral, more pure, more spiritual than men. It said women's influence in the home was sacred and important. But this supposed elevation was actually a cage. Because if women were too pure for the corrupting world of business and politics, then they could not vote, could not own property, could not have careers. If they were too delicate for intellectual pursuits, they could not attend university or enter professions. If their sacred duty was motherhood and domesticity, then any woman who wanted something else was betraying her essential nature. The ideology made women responsible for men's moral behavior, while giving them no power to enforce it. Women were supposed to civilize and refine men through their gentle influence. If a man behaved badly, it was often blamed on his wife or mother not providing sufficient moral guidance. One advice book states, "A man is what his mother and wife make him. If he drinks, gambles, or frequents immoral establishments, one must ask what failures in his home drove him to such behavior." Imagine that burden. You are responsible for your husband's moral character, but you have no legal rights, no economic independence, no authority to stop him from doing anything. If he destroys the family through drinking or gambling, you are blamed for not stopping him, even though you legally could not. The cult of true womanhood also created impossible standards that varied by class in revealing ways. For wealthy women, the ideal was to be so refined and delicate that they did no physical labor at all. They managed servants, they engaged in genteel pursuits like needlework and painting, they made social calls. But poor women still had to do all that brutal physical labor we discussed earlier. How did the ideology account for this? It simply said that poor women and immigrant women were less refined, less truly feminine. Their necessity to work was proof of their lower status, and their work made them even less ladylike. For enslaved women, the ideology was even more twisted. They were forced to do the hardest physical labor, they were denied any protection of their purity or virtue, they had no rights to their own children or their own bodies, and then they were told they were not really women at all in the sense that white women were. The very characteristics that supposedly defined true womanhood, purity and delicacy, were denied to them by default. Free black women faced a different but equally impossible situation. They were expected to conform to standards of respectability to prove their worthiness, but the dominant culture refused to see them as capable of true womanhood, no matter how impeccably they behaved. Now, you might be wondering, did any women push back against this? Oh, absolutely! And we will talk more about that resistance later in this journey. But for now, I want you to understand how powerful this ideology was. It was reinforced everywhere. In churches where ministers preached about women's sacred domestic duties, in magazines and newspapers, in advice books and etiquette manuals, in schools where girls were taught that education should prepare them for wifehood and motherhood, nothing more. It was enforced through social pressure. A woman who stepped outside these bounds risked being labelled unwomanly, which could destroy her reputation and her marriage prospects. In a world where women had no economic independence and few options outside marriage, this was a genuine threat. And perhaps most insidiously, many women internalized these beliefs. They genuinely came to believe that they were naturally more moral but less intellectual than men, that their fulfillment could only come through serving their families, that wanting anything beyond domesticity was a character flaw they needed to overcome. Imagine being told your entire life that your worth depends on being a certain way, and that way requires suppressing your own thoughts, desires, ambitions, and even your physical strength. Imagine being praised for making yourself smaller, quieter, weaker, less. Some women found genuine satisfaction within these constraints. They loved their children, they took pride in their homes, they found meaning in the roles they were given, and that is valid. The problem was not domesticity itself, but the fact that it was the only acceptable option. Other women chafed against the restrictions, but had no vocabulary to express their frustration. They felt vaguely dissatisfied, unfulfilled, but they had been taught that these feelings were evidence of moral failure, not legitimate responses to unjust constraints. And a brave few openly challenged the ideology, though they paid dearly for it. Women who spoke publicly, who published controversial ideas, who demanded education or property rights were called unwomanly, unnatural, even insane. The cult of true womanhood was brilliant in its own terrible way. It made oppression feel like protection. It made restriction feel like reverence. It convinced women that the cage was actually a pedestal, and that wanting to step down from the pedestal was a betrayal of their own sacred nature. But here is what the ideology could not account for. Reality kept intruding. Women might be told they were too delicate for education, but they learned anyway when they could. They might be told their sphere was only the home, but economic necessity or personal drive pushed many into work outside that sphere. They might be told to be submissive, but they still had thoughts, opinions, and the intelligence to recognize injustice when they experienced it. And slowly, painfully slowly, cracks began to appear in the ideology. Women started asking dangerous questions. If we are so moral, why can we not vote on moral issues? If education damages us, why are European women being educated without apparent harm? If our influence is so sacred, why does it count for nothing in law? But before we get to that resistance and awakening, we need to understand one more piece of the puzzle. Because while society was praising women's moral purity and delicate nature, it was simultaneously denying them the very education that might have helped them escape these constraints. The question of women's education in early 1800s America reveals perhaps the deepest contradictions of all. Here is a statistic that should make you pause. In 1730, about half of all women born in America could not read or write their own names. When they needed to sign a document, they made an X. But by 1830, just 100 years later, the vast majority of women were literate. That sounds like progress, right? A triumph of education and enlightenment. Except here is what that literacy was for. Reading the Bible to children, following recipes, writing household accounts, understanding moral literature that reinforced women's domestic duties. Women were taught to read not to free their minds, but to make them better servants to their families and to God. And the line between acceptable literacy and dangerous education was guarded as fiercely as a military border. Let me take you inside the world of women's education in early 1800s America, because the contradictions are almost beautiful in their absurdity. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, most girls who received any education at all attended what were called dame schools. These were not real schools in the way we understand them. They were usually just the home of a woman in the community, often a widow who needed income, who would gather neighborhood girls in her kitchen or parlor and teach them basic reading and perhaps a little writing. The curriculum was minimal. Girls learned their letters, perhaps using a hornbook, which was a wooden paddle with a printed page protected by a thin sheet of horn. They might practice reading from the Bible, or from moral primers with titles like the New England Primer, which taught the alphabet through religious lessons. A's, in Adam's fall we sinned all. B, thy life to mend, this book attend. Some girls learned basic arithmetic, enough to manage a household budget or calculate prices at market. But higher mathematics, unnecessary for a future housewife. And here is something fascinating. Many girls were taught to read but deliberately not taught to write. Does that seem strange? It should, but there was reasoning behind it. Writing was considered a more advanced skill, one that required education and practice. More importantly, writing meant the ability to communicate independently, to record thoughts, to engage with ideas beyond the immediate household. For women, this was seen as unnecessary at best and dangerous at worst. A woman who could only read could absorb information and instruction. A woman who could write could create her own messages, her own ideas, her own voice, and that was threatening to the social order. This is why, throughout the colonial period and into the early 1800s, so many women's signatures on legal documents are just an X. They could read well enough to understand what they were signing, but they could not write their own names. Think about what that means. You understand the words on the page. You know what the document says, but you cannot even write your own identity. You must mark yourself with a symbol that says, I am here, but I have no written voice. Now, for girls from wealthy families, education looked somewhat different, but not necessarily better. Rich girls might have tutors or attend private academies or finishing schools, but the focus of their education was on accomplishments, not academics. They learned French not because they were to read French literature or philosophy, but because speaking French was fashionable. They learned to play piano or harp not to become musicians, but to provide pleasant entertainment in the parlour. They learned drawing and watercolour painting, embroidery, deportment, dancing. One catalogue from a fashionable girls' academy in 1820 lists the curriculum: reading, writing, English grammar, geography, use of globes, ancient and modern history, composition, French language, drawing, painting, music, needlework, and deportment. That sounds comprehensive until you realise the depth of study in each subject was minimal. A girl might study history by memorising dates and kings, not by analysing causes or questioning narratives. She might learn geography by looking at maps, not by understanding economics or politics. Everything was surface level, designed to make her an ornament to her future husband's home, not an independent thinker. And there were subjects explicitly forbidden or considered inappropriate for female minds. Higher mathematics, classical languages like Latin and Greek, which were the foundation of college education for men, philosophy, political economy, law, science beyond basic natural history. Why were these forbidden? Let me share some of the justifications that were published in educational treatises and medical journals of the era. One popular theory, promoted by male physicians and educators, was that women's brains were physically smaller and less capable of abstract reasoning. An 1828 medical text states, "The female brain, being of lesser size and more delicate construction than the male brain, is suited to concrete domestic concerns rather than abstract philosophical speculation." Another common argument was that women's monthly cycles made them temperamentally unsuitable for sustained intellectual work. One doctor writing in 1837 claimed, "The periodic disturbances natural to the female constitution render her unable to maintain the consistency of thought required for higher learning." But perhaps the most insidious argument was this: too much education would make women unmarriageable. Men did not want wives who were smarter than them, or who had opinions about subjects beyond the household. An educated woman was a threat to domestic harmony. A widely read advice book from 1830 counsels young women: "Beware of displaying too much learning in company. particularly in the company of gentlemen. Men admire a woman's modesty and defer to their judgment on practical matters. A woman who speaks with authority on subjects properly belonging to male discourse will find herself respected perhaps, but not loved. Not loved. That was the ultimate threat. Because in a world where marriage was economic survival, being unmarriageable was genuinely frightening. So women learned to hide their intelligence. They learned to ask men to explain things they already understood. They learned to defer to male authority even when they knew the man was wrong. They learned to make themselves smaller, intellectually, to fit into the space society had designed for them. But here is where the story gets interesting. Because despite all these restrictions, despite the ideology and the barriers and the threats, some women were getting educated anyway. Starting in the late 1700s and accelerating in the early 1800s, a new type of institution began to appear. The female seminary or female academy. These were more serious educational institutions than dame schools or finishing schools. They offered real academic curricula, and they were founded and run by women who understood that education was the key to everything else. Let me tell you about some of these pioneers, because their stories are remarkable. Emma Willard opened a school in her home in Middlebury, Vermont in 1814, but she had bigger ambitions. In 1821, she founded the Troy Female Seminary in Troy, New York, with support from the town's leaders. This school offered an astonishingly comprehensive curriculum for the time. Young women at Troy studied mathematics, including algebra and geometry. They studied natural philosophy, which we would call physics. They studied geography, history, languages. They had a real library. They used globes and maps and scientific instruments. Willard believed that women's minds were just as capable as men's. She wrote, "The main cause of the difference in mental powers between the sexes lies in the difference in their education. Give girls the same training as boys, and they will achieve the same results." This was revolutionary. She was not saying women should be educated to be better wives and mothers. She was saying women deserved education for its own sake because their minds were equal to men's. But even Willard had to be strategic. She could not directly challenge male authority or suggest that women should enter male professions, so she framed her arguments carefully. Women needed better education, she said, so they could be better teachers of their own children. An educated mother would raise educated sons who would be better citizens. This argument was acceptable to male gatekeepers because it kept women's education tied to their domestic roles. But it also opened a door. Once women were educated, once their minds were developed, they could not be easily convinced to stay in the narrow sphere society had drawn for them. Catherine Beecher, daughter of the famous preacher Lyman Beecher, founded the Hartford Female Seminary in 1823. Like Willard, she had to navigate carefully between advocating for women's education and not appearing to challenge male authority. Beecher argued that teaching was a natural profession for women. It was an extension of their maternal, nurturing nature, and teaching required education. Therefore, women needed robust educational institutions to train them as teachers. This opened another door. Teaching was one of the very few paid professions considered acceptable for women. It did not pay well, particularly compared to what male teachers earned, and usually women were required to resign if they married, because a married woman's place was in her own home, not in a classroom. But it was something. It was a crack in the wall. Women who became teachers had income, had a profession, had a role in the world beyond their own domestic sphere. Mary Lyon founded Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in 1837. This institution was specifically designed to be affordable for middle-class and even some working-class families. Lyon believed passionately that education should not be only for the wealthy. Mount Holyoke had an unusual system. Students did domestic work to keep the costs down. They cleaned, cooked, did laundry for the school. Critics said this proved women's education was not serious. Lyon turned it around. She said it taught practical skills alongside academic ones, and it meant that girls from modest families could afford to attend. The curriculum at Mount Holyoke was rigorous: chemistry, astronomy, rhetoric, philosophy. Students read classical authors. They studied theology and were encouraged to think critically about religious question, though always within a Christian framework. And here is what is remarkable. The education these women received changed them. You cannot study chemistry and not develop analytical thinking skills. You cannot study philosophy and not start questioning assumptions. You cannot learn history and not start wondering about your own place in the historical narrative. Graduates of these female seminaries became teachers, yes, but they also became writers, reformers, activists. They became women who understood that their subordinate status was not natural or inevitable, but constructed and therefore changeable. But we need to be clear about something. These opportunities were available only to free white women, and usually only to those from families with at least some financial resources. Enslaved girls and women had no access to formal education at all. In fact, in many southern states it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read and write. Slaveholders understood that literacy was dangerous. A person who could read might read abolitionist literature. A person who could write might forge passes or freedom papers. Education was power, and power in the hands of enslaved people threatened the entire system. Some enslaved people learned to read and write anyway, in secret, at great risk. They taught each other. They used materials they could scavenge. But it was dangerous, and discovery could mean brutal punishment. Free black women faced different but still severe barriers. Some communities had schools for free black children, but these were often underfunded, understaffed, and periodically shut down by hostile white authorities. Free black women who managed to obtain an education did so despite enormous obstacles, and they often used that education to teach others in their community. For Native American women, education was often entangled with forced assimilation. Mission schools and later government boarding schools aimed to erase indigenous culture and replace it with Euro-American values. The education offered was intended to make Native girls into domestic servants, not independent thinkers. So when we talk about women's education in early 1800s America, we have to acknowledge that progress was uneven, limited, and available only to some. But even within those limitations, education changed things. By 1840, literacy rates for white women had soared to around 90%. Women were reading, and what they read included novels, magazines, newspapers, political tracts. Publishers noticed. They started creating content specifically for female readers. Ladies' magazines like Godey's Lady's Book, which we mentioned earlier. Novels written by women for women about women's experiences. And here is where it gets subversive. Women writers began exploring themes that challenged the status quo. They wrote about unhappy marriages, about women trapped in domestic drudgery, about the desire for something more. Charlotte Perkins Gilman would later write The Yellow Wallpaper, a story about a woman driven mad by being confined to domestic rest. Louisa May Alcott would write about the March Sisters, girls with dreams and ambitions beyond marriage. Harriet Beecher Stowe would write Uncle Tom's Cabin, a political novel that helped change the national conversation about slavery. These writers were the daughters and granddaughters of women educated in those early female seminaries. Their education gave them tools, literacy, analytical skills, the confidence to believe their voices mattered. By the 1850s and 60s, the question was no longer whether women should be educated at all. The question was how much education was appropriate and what they should be allowed to do with it. Some women began demanding access to colleges and universities. Oberlin College in Ohio admitted women beginning in 1837, the first coeducational college in America. But women at Oberlin were initially placed in a separate ladies' course that was less rigorous than the classical curriculum offered to men. It was not until 1841 that Oberlin awarded Bachelor of Arts degrees to 3 women who had completed the full classical course alongside male students. This was revolutionary. These were women with the same education as men preparing for law, medicine, ministry, and predictably there was backlash. Critics said these educated women would become unmarriageable spinsters. They said women's health would be destroyed by study. They said it was unnatural and dangerous. But the women kept coming. By the 1860s and 70s, women's colleges like Vassar, Wellesley and Smith were being founded. These were institutions that took women's intellectual capabilities seriously, that did not assume women needed watered-down curricula or education only for domestic purposes. The women who graduated from these institutions became the first generation of female doctors, lawyers, scientists, professors. They became suffragists and reformers and activists. They became women who had the education, the confidence, and the analytical tools to look at the world and say, "This is unjust, and it must change." But even as late as the 1870s and 80s, the idea that women's education was dangerous persisted. That book I mentioned earlier, Sex in Education by Dr. Edward Clark from Harvard, was published in 1873. It argued, with supposed medical evidence, that women who attended college damaged their reproductive systems. This was not ancient history. This was after the Civil War. After women had proven themselves capable during the war by running farms and businesses, by nursing wounded soldiers, by managing without men. And still, there were doctors and educators arguing that women's brains could not handle serious study. The fight for education was never just about access to classrooms. It was about the fundamental question of what women were capable of, what they deserved, whether their minds mattered as much as their domestic skills. And every woman who learned to write her own name instead of marking an X, every girl who studied mathematics instead of just needlework, every graduate who went on to teach or write or reform, was proof that the ideology limiting women was wrong. Education was the key that unlocked other doors, because a woman with education could earn money teaching. A woman who could earn money had some economic independence. A woman with economic independence was less desperate to marry the first man who offered. A woman with analytical skills could read law books and understand that her legal status was unjust. A woman with confidence in her own mind could question male authority. This is why education was so fiercely contested. This is why every advance was hard won. Because everyone understood that knowledge really was power, and power in women's hands threatened the entire system of female subordination. Yet even with education, even with literacy and learning, women still faced another set of constraints that had nothing to do with their minds and everything to do with their bodies. The medical profession had its own ideas about women's nature, and those ideas were used to justify keeping women weak, dependent, and under control. The health horrors that women endured, often with medical approval, reveal yet another layer of suffering. What if I told you that doctors in early 1800s America believed that women's uteruses could wander around inside their bodies, causing hysteria and madness? Or that menstruation was considered a disease that required bed rest and isolation? Or that the medical establishment prescribed treatments for women's health problems that were often more dangerous than the conditions they claimed to cure? You would probably think I was describing medieval superstition, not 19th century medicine in a nation that prided itself on progress and enlightenment. but every single one of these beliefs was mainstream medical opinion in early 1800s America. Let me take you into the world of women's health during this period, because the combination of ignorance, misogyny, and genuine suffering created a perfect storm of medical horror. First, we need to understand that the entire medical profession's approach to women's bodies was fundamentally flawed. Doctors, who were exclusively male for most of this period, believed that women's reproductive organs controlled essentially everything about their physical and mental health. An 1848 medical textbook states quite seriously, "The uterus is the controlling organ in the female body. All other systems are subordinate to it. When the uterus is disordered, the entire woman becomes disordered in mind and body." This was not fringe thinking. This was what doctors were being taught in medical schools. This belief led to some truly bizarre diagnoses. Did a woman complain of headaches? Uterine disorder. Was she anxious or sad? Uterine disorder. Did she have opinions her husband disagreed with? Definitely a uterine disorder. The catch-all diagnosis was hysteria, from the Greek word for uterus. Hysteria could manifest as almost any symptom: nervousness, fainting, insomnia, irritability, loss of appetite, difficulty breathing, or simply behavior that men found inconvenient. And what were the treatments for hysteria? This is where things get truly disturbing. Some doctors prescribed bed rest, not for a few days, for weeks or even months. A woman would be confined to her bed, forbidden from reading, writing, or engaging in any mental stimulation. She was to lie still and be fed bland foods, all to calm her supposedly overexcited nervous system. Other doctors prescribed the opposite: vigorous physical activity and cold baths to shock the system back into proper function. Still others recommended bleeding, the ancient practice of cutting a vein to drain supposed bad humours from the body. Women were bled regularly for menstrual complaints, headaches, and nervous disorders, which of course made them weaker and more prone to actual illness. But perhaps the most invasive treatments involved the reproductive organs themselves. Some doctors genuinely believed that the clitoris caused hysteria and recommended removal. Yes, you read that correctly. Clitoridectomy, the surgical removal of the clitoris, was performed on women and girls in America as a cure for masturbation, nervousness, and rebellious behavior. This was not rare or secret. It was discussed in medical journals. Doctors published papers about their success rates. The practice continued into the early 1900s in some places. Now let me talk about something that affected virtually every woman: menstruation. In our time, we understand menstruation as a normal biological process. In early 1800s America, it was treated as a monthly illness that rendered women weak, irrational, and in need of special care. Women were advised to avoid physical exertion during their periods. No heavy lifting, no long walks, no dancing, no bathing. Some medical advice warned that bathing during menstruation could cause the blood to stop flowing, backing up into the body and causing madness or death. Women were told to avoid mental exertion as well. No reading difficult books, no mathematical calculations, no intense conversations. Their blood was supposedly diverted to the uterus, leaving insufficient supply for the brain. This is the same medical reasoning that was used to argue women should not attend college, as we discussed earlier. The idea was that during menstruation, and really throughout the monthly cycle, women's bodies were in such a delicate, disordered state that any additional demand would cause collapse. Think about the implications. Women were expected to do brutal physical labour every single day, but during menstruation, they were told they should rest. Of course, most women could not rest. The work had to be done regardless. So women simply suffered in silence, doing back-breaking labour while experiencing menstrual cramps, with no pain relief and no acknowledgement of their discomfort. There was no such thing as menstrual products as we know them. Women used rags, hence the term on the rag, which had to be washed and reused. Imagine doing that laundry we discussed earlier, but now you're also washing and hiding your menstrual cloths, because the entire subject was so taboo that even mentioning it was shameful. Now let us talk about prolapse. This is a condition we touched on briefly when discussing childbirth, but it deserves more attention because it was devastatingly common and completely debilitating. Uterine prolapse occurs when the muscles and ligaments supporting the uterus become so weakened that the uterus drops down into the vaginal canal, or in severe cases, protrudes outside the body entirely. This was caused by multiple childbirths, especially if births were close together, by heavy physical labour before the body had recovered from birth, and by generally weakened pelvic floor muscles. In early 1800s America, with women having many children and returning to heavy labour immediately after birth, prolapse was extremely common. Some estimates suggest that as many as 1 in 3 women who had given birth multiple times experienced some degree of prolapse. The symptoms were awful: constant discomfort or pain, difficulty walking, urinary incontinence, an inability to do heavy lifting, which was a disaster for women whose survival depended on physical labour, and the profound shame of a visible, undeniable physical problem in an era when women's bodies were supposed to be kept private and hidden. There was no surgical repair available in the early 1800s. Some doctors fitted women with pessaries, devices inserted into the vagina to hold the uterus in place. These were made of various materials including wood, metal, or rubber, and they were often uncomfortable and could cause infections. Many women simply lived with the condition, adapting their lives as best they could, suffering in silence because there was no treatment and because discussing such intimate physical problems was considered deeply shameful. Then there were fistulas, which we mentioned briefly before. These were holes that developed between the vaginal wall and the bladder or rectum, usually caused by prolonged obstructed labour, where the baby's head pressed against soft tissues for so long that the tissue died and a hole formed. A woman with a vesicovaginal fistula, a hole between the vagina and bladder, would leak urine constantly. A woman with a rectovaginal fistula would leak feces. There was no way to control it, no way to stop it. No surgical repair available. These women became outcasts. The smell alone made them unwelcome in public spaces, or even in their own homes. Husbands sometimes abandoned them, communities shunned them. They lived in isolated misery, often for decades, because they had committed the crime of trying to give birth and their bodies had been destroyed in the process. It was not until the mid to late 1800s that a doctor named James Marion Sims developed surgical techniques to repair fistulas. And here is a dark footnote to that story. He perfected his technique by performing experimental surgeries on enslaved women without anesthesia, justifying this by claiming that black women did not feel pain the same way white women did. This racist lie allowed him to use enslaved women's bodies for medical experimentation. Now, let us talk about something that affected women across all classes: anemia. Chronic, debilitating anemia from poor nutrition, repeated childbirths, and blood loss from menstruation. Women's diets in early 1800s America were often inadequate. They fed their husbands and children first, eating whatever remained. They were pregnant or nursing for much of their adult lives, which depleted their iron stores. They lost blood monthly through menstruation, and many were periodically bled by doctors as a medical treatment. The result was that many women walked around in a constant state of anemia. They were weak, pale, short of breath, constantly exhausted. But because this was so common, it was just accepted as normal. Women were supposed to be delicate and weak. Their chronic exhaustion was seen as proof of their refined feminine nature, not as a medical condition requiring treatment. And speaking of things that were accepted as normal, let us discuss corsets in more medical detail. We have talked about them briefly, but the actual physical damage they caused is shocking. Corsets were not just uncomfortable, they were genuinely dangerous. Tightly laced corsets compressed the ribcage, making it impossible to breathe deeply. This meant women's lungs could not fully expand, leading to shallow breathing and reduced oxygen intake. The compression also pushed internal organs out of their natural positions. The liver could be pushed downward. The stomach compressed. The intestines crowded. This led to chronic digestive problems, difficulty eating full meals, and sometimes damage to the organs themselves. Medical records from the period document cases of ribs being broken by corsets, of women fainting multiple times per day because they could not breathe adequately, of chronic coughing and lung problems caused by restricted breathing. Some women developed permanently deformed rib cages from wearing tight corsets from adolescence onward. And yet when doctors warned about corset damage, women often ignored them. Why? Because appearing in public without the proper silhouette was social suicide. A woman's worth was judged by her appearance, and the ideal appearance required a tiny waist achievable only through corseting. So women chose social acceptability over physical health. Or rather, they were forced to choose, because the social consequences of not wearing a corset were severe enough to outweigh the medical consequences of wearing one. Here is something else that rarely gets discussed: the complete lack of understanding about basic hygiene as it related to women's health. Doctors did not yet understand germ theory. They did not know that washing hands prevented infection. They did not know that the same unwashed instruments used on multiple patients could spread disease. This meant that any medical intervention carried enormous risk. A doctor examining a pregnant woman might do so with unwashed hands after examining other patients, or even after performing an autopsy. This is how puerperal fever spread so widely in hospitals. When women did seek medical care, the examination itself was often traumatic. Male doctors examining women's bodies was considered somewhat scandalous, so examinations were often done under a sheet, with the doctor working by feel alone, unable to see what he was doing. Imagine trying to diagnose a medical problem or assist a difficult birth when you cannot actually see the patient's body. Some women refused male doctors entirely and relied only on midwives or female relatives for care. This could be safer in terms of avoiding cross-contamination from the doctor's other patients, but it also meant missing out on any medical knowledge or interventions that might have helped. The lack of pain management options meant that any medical procedure was agony. Surgery, when it happened, was performed without anesthesia until the mid-1800s. Even after ether and chloroform became available, some doctors were hesitant to use them on women, believing that pain in childbirth was divinely ordained, or that women had a moral duty to experience it fully. There is a recorded debate from the 1850s where some doctors argued that pain relief in childbirth was wrong because the Bible says women shall bring forth children in sorrow, as if deliberately allowing suffering was somehow religious virtue rather than cruelty. Let me tell you about one more medical horror: the treatment of mental illness in women. Any woman who showed signs of depression, anxiety, or behavior that her family found difficult could be declared insane and institutionalized. The criteria for female insanity were shockingly broad. Did she refuse to do housework? Possibly insane. Did she express political opinions? Definitely suspicious. Was she unhappy in her marriage? Clear evidence of mental derangement. Once institutionalized, women were subjected to treatments that were at best useless and at worst torturous. Ice baths, restraints, isolation, being spun rapidly in chairs until they vomited, based on the theory that this would somehow rebalance their disordered humors. And here is the truly insidious part. A husband could have his wife institutionalized quite easily. If he wanted to be rid of her, if she had inherited money he wanted to control, if she objected to his behavior, he could simply claim she was mad. A cooperative doctor would examine her, find evidence of hysteria or mania, and she would be locked away. She had no legal recourse. Remember coverture. She could not sue in her own name. She could not control her own property. She certainly could not fight a medical diagnosis made by male doctors and supported by her husband. Some women spent years, even decades, in asylums for offences as minor as talking back or being insufficiently submissive. Their lives were destroyed, their children taken from them, their legal existence erased even more completely than usual. Now, I want to be clear about something. There were many doctors who genuinely wanted to help their patients. There were medical advances happening. Anesthesia was developed. Antiseptic techniques were slowly being discovered and adopted. Understanding of anatomy and physiology was improving. But the pace of change was glacially slow. And in the meantime, women suffered. They suffered from actual medical conditions that could not be treated. They suffered from unnecessary treatments prescribed by ignorant doctors. They suffered from a medical system that saw their bodies as inherently diseased and their complaints as evidence of weakness or hysteria. And they suffered in silence because complaining about physical discomfort was considered unladylike. A true woman bore her suffering with grace and resignation. To admit pain, to seek help, to insist on being taken seriously, all of these could be interpreted as evidence of moral or mental weakness. So women endured prolapse and fistulas and anemia and the after effects of difficult births. They endured painful periods and the restrictions placed on them because of menstruation. They endured medical treatments that harmed more than helped. They endured it all while maintaining the fiction that they were delicate, fragile creatures who needed male protection. The contradiction was stunning. Women were supposedly too weak for education or political involvement, yet strong enough to survive medical ordeals that would have felled most men. They were supposedly too delicate for intellectual pursuits, yet resilient enough to live with chronic pain and disability for decades. But even these physical and medical constraints, crushing as they were, existed within a larger legal and economic framework that made women's suffering invisible and uncompensated. Because while women could not control their own health, they also could not control the wealth they helped create. The economics of dependency created yet another prison, one that locked women into poverty even when their labour made their families prosperous. Imagine working from dawn until late at night, 7 days a week, for your entire adult life, and never receiving a single penny of wages. Imagine creating value with your labour that keeps your family fed, clothed and functioning, but having no legal claim to any of the wealth that labour produces. Imagine earning money through your own skills and effort, only to have every cent immediately become the property of someone else. This was not slavery, though it shared some disturbing similarities. This was a marriage for women in early 1800s America, and the economic system that made it possible was the same as legal doctrine we discussed at the beginning, coverture. But now, I want to show you how coverture worked in practice when it came to money, property, and economic survival. Because the legal erasure of women was not just philosophical, it had brutal, practical consequences that left women economically vulnerable their entire lives. Let me start with a scenario that was devastatingly common. A young woman, let us call her Mary, inherits money from her father when he dies. She is 22, unmarried, and according to the law she is a femme sole. She has legal rights. That inheritance is hers. She can manage it, invest it, spend it as she chooses. Mary meets a man and marries him. The instant she speaks her wedding vows, that money becomes his, not theirs, his. He can spend it on whatever he likes without asking her permission. He can gamble it away. He can make terrible investments. He can give it to his mistress if he has one, and Mary has absolutely no legal recourse. She cannot sue him. She cannot leave him and take her money back. It is gone, absorbed into his legal identity just as completely as her own identity was. Now, you might think surely there were some protections. Surely fathers who were leaving money to daughters wrote their wills in ways that protected that inheritance. Some tried. Wealthy families sometimes established marriage settlements or trusts that kept a woman's inherited property separate from her husband's control. But these required expensive legal work and a trustee, usually the woman's father or brother, to manage the property on her behalf. Even then, the woman herself could not manage her own money. It was just managed by a different man, and these protections were only available to wealthy families. For everyone else, marriage meant complete economic absorption into the husband's legal and financial identity. But here is where it gets even more outrageous. Let us say Mary does not inherit money. Instead, she works. This was increasingly common as the 1800s progressed. Women worked as seamstress, as laundresses, as factory workers, as teachers, as shopkeepers. Every penny Mary earns belongs to her husband, legally, automatically. The moment she receives payment, it becomes his property. Think about what this means in practical terms. Mary works 12 hours a day in a textile factory. The work is exhausting, the conditions are dangerous, and the pay is terrible. But at least it is pay, right? Money she can use to help support her family or save for emergencies? No, her wages are paid directly to her husband, or if they are paid to her, she must immediately hand them over to him. She has no legal right to keep even a portion of her own earnings. An 1850 census taker in Massachusetts recorded this exchange with a woman who did laundry for wealthy families. When asked who managed the earnings from her labour, she replied with bitter laughter, "Manages them? My husband collects the money before I even see it. The ladies I wash for pay him directly now, as he insisted. I work my fingers raw and have not a cent to call my own." This was entirely legal, entirely normal, entirely accepted. Now let me tell you what happened when a husband was irresponsible with money. Remember that under coverture, a wife had the right to be maintained in a manner appropriate to her husband's social class. If he failed to provide, she could theoretically sue for support. But what if he did not fail to provide? What if he provided the bare minimum while spending the rest on himself? What if he made bad business decisions that slowly drained the family resources? What if he simply preferred spending money on his own pleasures rather than household necessities? Too bad. A wife had no control. She could not stop him from making bad investments. She could not prevent him from gambling. She could not save money secretly because any money she had was legally his. Court records from the period are full of cases where women watched helplessly as their husbands destroyed the family finances. One case from 1838 in New York involves a woman whose husband sold the house her father had left her, pocketed the money, gambled it away, and left her and their children homeless. She sued to get the house back, arguing that it had been her inheritance and her husband had no right to sell it. The court ruled against her. Once she married, the house became her husband's property to do with as he pleased. The fact that he had destroyed their family's security was regrettable but entirely legal. Another case from 1842 involves a woman who ran a successful boarding house. She managed the business, did all the work, built up a good reputation and a steady income. Her husband contributed nothing to the business but was legally entitled to all the profits. He took the money and spent it on alcohol and gambling. She tried to establish the business in her own name, to claim legal ownership of the income from her own labour. The court said no. As a married woman, she could not own a business, could not enter into contracts, could not claim earnings. Everything she earned belonged to her husband. Can you imagine the frustration, the rage that must have simmered beneath the surface of enforced compliance? Working yourself to exhaustion to build something, watching someone else destroy it, and having no legal recourse whatsoever. Here is another economic reality that often gets overlooked. Women's domestic labour, all the cooking and cleaning and childcare and washing we discussed earlier, had enormous economic value. But because it happened within the home and was performed by wives and mothers, it was not counted as real work. Economic historians who have tried to calculate the value of women's domestic labour estimate that if women in the 1800s had been paid for their household work at the rates paid to domestic servants, their labour would have represented a massive portion of household income. One calculation suggests that a wife's domestic labour was worth between $300 and $500 per year in mid-1800s currency. To put that in perspective, a skilled male labourer might earn between $400 and $600 per year. A woman's unpaid domestic labour was nearly equivalent to a full-time wage, but that labour was invisible in economic terms. It did not count as contribution. It gave women no claim to household wealth. A husband could leave his wife penniless, and there was no calculation of how much her decades of unpaid labour had contributed to the family's economic success. Now let us talk about what happened when marriages ended, either through death or the rare divorce. If a husband died, what happened to his widow? Under the legal principle of dower rights, a widow was entitled to a life interest in 1/3 of her husband's real estate. She could live in the house or use the property, but she could not sell it. She could benefit from 1/3 of the income, but the property itself would pass to the husband's heirs, usually his children. If there were no real estate, if the family wealth was in cash or goods, the widow's portion was even more restricted. She might receive 1/3 of the personal property, but often much less. And here is the cruel part. If the husband died in debt, creditors could claim the entire estate before the widow received anything. That life interest in 1/3 of the property? Gone, sold to pay the husband's debts. The widow could be left with literally nothing except what the law called necessities, typically 2 dresses, basic cooking utensils, and a bed. Think about that. A woman could work her entire married life, contribute her labour and possibly her own inheritance to the family economy, and then be left destitute when her husband died, with nothing to show for decades of work. Widows were often desperately poor. They had few options for supporting themselves. If they were old, they could not do heavy labour. If they had young children, they could not leave home to work. Taking in sewing or laundry earned pittance wages. Many widows ended up dependent on their children's charity or, if they had no family, in poorhouses. The poorhouse was a nightmare. It was where people who had no money and no family to support them ended up. Conditions were deliberately harsh, based on the theory that poverty was a moral failing and comfort would encourage laziness. Widows in poorhouses did hard labour in exchange for minimal food and shelter, often living in crowded, unsanitary conditions. And this could happen to any woman whose husband died without leaving adequate provision. Your economic security lasted only as long as your husband lived and managed money well. You had no control, no safety net, no recourse. Now let us talk about divorce, which was even more economically devastating for women. Divorce was rare in early 1800 America, but it did happen. Different states had different laws. Some allowed divorce only for adultery or extreme cruelty. Some allowed divorce for desertion. Some essentially did not allow it at all. But in any case, when a divorce did occur, the economic consequences for women were catastrophic. The husband typically kept all property, including any the wife had brought to the marriage. He kept all earnings, and most devastatingly, he typically kept the children, Under coverture, children belonged to the father. He had legal custody. He decided where they lived, how they were raised, who saw them. A mother had no rights to her own children, so a woman seeking divorce had to choose: stay in a miserable or even abusive marriage, or leave and lose her children and any claim to economic support. Many women chose to stay precisely because they could not bear to lose their children. Those who did divorce often faced dire poverty. They had no property, no savings, no legal claim to anything. If they had skills, they could try to support themselves through work. But remember, women's wages were a fraction of men's wages. A woman working as a seamstress might earn $2 per week when a male tailor earned $8 for the same amount of work. And divorced women faced social stigma that made finding work even harder. A divorced woman was considered morally suspect. Respectable families might not hire her as a governess or teacher. Landlords might refuse to rent to her. She was economically and socially marked. Here is a particularly cruel irony. The Panic of 1837, a major economic depression, helped spark the first Married Women's Property Acts. But not because men suddenly developed sympathy for women's economic vulnerability. What happened was this. When men went into debt and creditors came to collect, the creditors could seize everything, including property the wife had brought to the marriage. Wealthy families realized this was a problem. If a daughter married a man who later failed in business, her inheritance could be seized to pay his debts. So Mississippi passed the first Married Women's Property Act in 1839. But notice what it protected: a woman's right to own property but not to control it. She could hold property in her name so creditors could not seize it for her husband's debts, but she could not sell it or manage it without his permission. This was not about women's rights. This was about protecting family wealth from creditors. But it opened a crack in the wall of coverture. New York's Married Women's Property Act of 1848 went further. It said a woman could own property brought into the marriage or inherited during the marriage, and that property could not be seized for her husband's debts. She still could not control wages she earned, could not enter into contracts freely, could not manage her property without restrictions, but it was progress. Other states slowly followed, but the process was agonizingly slow and the laws were interpreted as narrowly as possible by courts that wanted to preserve male authority. Even as late as the 1870s and 80s, there were court cases where judges ruled that married women could not run businesses, could not control their own earnings, could not make contracts. The reasoning was always the same: to give married women economic independence would destroy the sanctity of marriage. One 1867 Illinois court ruling stated explicitly, "It is simply impossible that a married woman should be able to control and enjoy her property as if she were sole, without practically leaving her at liberty to annul the marriage." Translation: if women had economic independence, they might leave bad marriages, and that threat was considered worse than economic injustice. Think about what this tells us. The system depended on women's economic dependence. If women could support themselves, if they could control their own money, if they had genuine choice about whether to marry or stay married, the entire social structure would be threatened. So that dependence had to be maintained. Through law, through custom, through social pressure, and through the very real threat of destitution if a woman tried to step outside the approved boundaries. But here is what gets me. Despite all of this, women found ways to survive economically. They took in sewing and laundry, they ran boarding houses, they worked in factories, they taught school, they created informal economies of mutual aid, helping each other when husbands were unreliable or absent. Free black women, who often had to work outside the home out of economic necessity, created networks of support, they pooled resources, they helped each other with childcare so they could work. They shared knowledge about which employers paid fairly and which exploited workers. Immigrant women did the same. Irish women worked as domestic servants and sent money back to Ireland to help their families or bring siblings over. German women ran family shops and businesses. Italian women did piecework at home, sewing garments by the piece for pennies. These women understood that their survival depended on work, on skill, on mutual support. They could not rely on legal protection or male benevolence. They relied on each other and on their own resilience, and slowly, painfully slowly, the laws began to change. More states passed married women's property acts. Courts began interpreting them more broadly. Women gained the right to control their own earnings, to enter into contracts, to sue and be sued in their own names. It was not altruism that drove these changes. It was women's relentless pressure, women's demonstrated capability, women's refusal to accept that their labour had no value and their economic contributions did not matter. But even as economic opportunities expanded slightly, even as legal restrictions began to ease, women still faced another fundamental constraint. They were trapped in marriages that could destroy them, with almost no legal avenue of escape. The marriage trap was enforced not just by law, but by the brutal reality of what happened to women who tried to leave. There is a particular kind of horror in knowing you are trapped, not trapped by walls or chains you can see, but trapped by law, by custom, by the complete absence of any acceptable alternative. And for women in early 1800s America, marriage was exactly that kind of trap. You entered freely, or at least you appeared to. Society called it a choice, but once inside, the door locked behind you. And for most women, there was no key, no exit, no escape, no matter what happened within those walls. Let me tell you exactly how the marriage trap worked, and why leaving an unhappy or even dangerous marriage was nearly impossible. First, understand that marriage was not optional for most women. Oh, technically you could choose not to marry. But the social and economic consequences of remaining single were so severe that it barely qualified as a real choice. An unmarried woman was called a spinster, and the term dripped with pity and contempt. Spinsters were seen as failures, women who could not attract a husband, women who would grow old alone, dependent on the charity of relatives, with no home of their own, no children, no real place in society. Even wealthy single women faced this stigma. They might have money, but they had no social status comparable to a married woman. They were perpetual dependents in their father's or brother's households, or if they lived alone, they were viewed with suspicion and gossip. For poor women, spinsterhood often meant genuine poverty. The jobs available to women paid so little that supporting yourself on a single woman's wages meant living in a boarding house room, eating cheaply, having no security and no prospect of anything better. So marriage was presented as the only real option. And once you married, you were supposed to stay married until death. Not until you grew apart, not until the relationship stopped working, until actual physical death separated you. Divorce was possible in some states, under some circumstances, but it was so difficult, so expensive, so socially devastating, and so economically dangerous for women that it might as well have been impossible for most. Let me walk you through what divorce actually required. Required in different parts of early 1800s America, because the variations are revealing. In the more conservative southern states, divorce was essentially not allowed. South Carolina, for example, did not permit absolute divorce at all until after the Civil War. The best you could hope for was a legal separation called divorce from bed and board. This meant you could live apart from your husband, and the court might order him to provide financial support, but you were still married. Neither of you could remarry. You were in permanent legal limbo. In northern states, absolute divorce was possible, but the grounds for divorce were extremely limited. Adultery was usually acceptable grounds. Extreme cruelty might qualify, though you had to prove it, and the bar for what counted as extreme was shockingly high. Desertion, if your husband abandoned you for a certain number of years, could be grounds. But here is the catch. Women who sought divorce faced enormous obstacles that men did not. First, the expense. Divorce required hiring a lawyer, filing papers, going through a court process. This cost money that most women did not have and could not get. Remember, their wages belonged to their husbands. Their property belonged to their husbands. How do you pay for a divorce lawyer when you legally own nothing? Some women convinced relatives to help them financially. Some borrowed money, but many simply could not afford the legal fees and so stayed trapped in miserable marriages not by choice but by poverty. Second, the evidence requirements. To prove adultery, you needed witnesses or written evidence. In an era before photography and with strict social codes about discussing sexual matters, getting proof was incredibly difficult. Husbands accused of adultery could simply deny it, and without clear evidence, the case failed. To prove extreme cruelty, you needed to show serious physical harm, not just slapping or shoving, not emotional abuse or verbal threats. Serious documented physical violence, and even then courts often questioned whether the woman had provoked the violence or whether she was exaggerating. One divorce case from 1842 in Massachusetts involved a woman whose husband had beaten her so severely on multiple occasions that neighbors testified they had heard her screaming. He had broken her arm during one beating. She had bruises and injuries documented by a doctor. The judge granted the divorce but noted in his written opinion that he hoped the wife would reflect on whether her own behavior had contributed to her husband's loss of temper. Think about that. She is beaten badly enough to break bones, and the judge suggests it might be partially her fault. Third, the social consequences. A divorced woman was scandal incarnate. She was assumed to be morally loose, sexually improper, a failure as a wife. Respectable families would not associate with her. She could not attend social gatherings, churches might refuse her communion. If she had daughters, their marriage prospects were damaged by having a divorced mother. If she had sons, they might face questions about their legitimacy or moral upbringing. The stigma was so intense that many women who had legitimate grounds for divorce chose to stay married rather than face social ostracism. Fourth, and perhaps most devastatingly, women who divorced lost their children. Under the law, children belonged to their father. He had custody. He decided where they lived, how they were raised, whether their mother could see them. A mother seeking divorce knew she would lose her children. They would stay with their father or be placed with his relatives. She might be allowed occasional supervised visits, or she might be cut off completely. Her husband could move to another state, taking the children with him, and she would have no legal recourse. Can you imagine making that choice? Stay in a marriage that is destroying you, or leave and lose your children forever? What would you choose? Many women chose to stay precisely because they could not abandon their children. They endured abuse, infidelity, neglect, knowing that if they left, they would lose the only thing that made their lives bearable. Now let me talk about what happened inside marriages when there was no realistic exit. Because the legal and social barriers to divorce created a situation where husbands had almost unlimited power over their wives, with very little accountability. A husband could commit adultery openly, he could keep a mistress, he could visit brothels, and while this might be considered morally wrong, it was not grounds for wife to deny him anything. She still had to welcome him to her bed. She still had to manage his household. She still had to present a happy face to the world. A wife who committed adultery, on the other hand, faced complete destruction. Her husband could divorce her immediately and keep all property and all children. She would be a social outcast. If she had been receiving any financial support from relatives, it would likely stop because she had brought shame on her family. The double standard was absolute and brutal. A husband could drink excessively, gamble away the family money, make terrible business decisions. His wife had to live with the consequences, but had no power to stop him. She could not take over management of the finances. She could not prevent him from selling property or taking on debt. She just had to watch as he destroyed their security and hope he would change. And when it came to physical violence, the law offered women almost no protection. Let me be very clear about this. A husband beating his wife was not automatically illegal. The concept of reasonable chastisement existed in American law, inherited from English common law. This legal principle held that a husband had the right to physically discipline his wife, just as he had the right to discipline his children or his servants, as long as he did not cause permanent serious injury or death. Some states codified this explicitly. One frequently referenced standard was the rule of thumb, the idea that a husband could beat his wife with a stick as long as it was no thicker than his thumb. Historians debate whether this was ever an actual written law or just a commonly understood standard, but the principle was clear. Moderate physical violence by a husband against his wife was acceptable. Police generally did not intervene in domestic disputes. These were considered private family matters. A woman could be screaming for help and neighbours might hear and do nothing because it was not their business. Even if police were called, they would often tell the husband to calm down and leave, considering the matter resolved. For a woman to press charges of assault against her husband, the violence had to be extreme and she needed witnesses, and often a male relative willing to support her case. Few women could meet these requirements. Court records from the period show cases where women sought legal protection from violent husbands and were told by judges to go home and try to be better wives. One case from 1838 involves a woman requesting a restraining order against her husband who had threatened to kill her. The judge denied the request, saying, "Marital disputes are best resolved within the home, not in a court of law. A good wife's gentle influence will soften even the hardest heart." She was murdered by her husband 6 weeks later. The court records note this fact without apparent irony or acknowledgement of the judge's role in her death. Here is something else that rarely gets discussed. Marital rape was not a crime. It was not even a concept that the law recognized. The legal theory was that by marrying, a woman gave permanent, irrevocable consent to sexual relations with her husband. An 1856 legal treatise states explicitly, "The husband cannot be guilty of a rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife, for by their mutual matrimonial consent and contract the wife hath given up herself in this kind unto her husband, which she cannot retract." Read that again. She cannot retract her consent. Once married, a woman had no right to refuse her husband sexual access, no matter the circumstances. He could force himself on her, and it was not rape, it was his legal right. This remained the law in most American states until the late 1900s. Massachusetts did not criminalize marital rape until 1984. North Carolina held out until 1993. Let me repeat that. 1993. Within our lifetimes, or our parents' lifetimes, there were states where a husband legally could not rape his wife because her consent was presumed permanent from the wedding day. Think about what this meant for women in abusive marriages in 1825. Your husband could beat you, force himself on you sexually, control every aspect of your life, and the law considered this normal marital relations. If you tried to leave, you faced poverty, loss of your children, and social destruction. You were trapped. Completely, legally, socially trapped. Now, some women did manage to escape. Let me tell you how, because their strategies reveal both incredible courage and the systematic barriers they faced. Some women fled. They literally ran away. sometimes in the middle of the night, taking their children if they could. They went to relatives who might shelter them despite the scandal. They went to other cities where they were not known and tried to start over under assumed names. But fugitive wives lived in constant fear of being found and forcibly returned to their husbands. A husband could hire someone to track down his runaway wife and drag her back. He had legal custody of the children, so if she had taken them, she was technically kidnapping her own children. Newspapers from the period contain advertisements from husbands seeking runaway wives, describing them and offering rewards for information. These ads are chilling. Women described like lost property. Rewards offered as if for a stolen horse. Some women found protection through their birth families. A father or brother with money and social standing might shield a woman from her husband, might hire lawyers to negotiate a separation agreement, might provide financial support. But this required having wealthy, supportive family members, which most women did not have. Some women turned to religious communities. Certain churches or convents would shelter abused women, though this often meant converting to a particular faith or living under strict religious rules. And it offered only temporary sanctuary, not a permanent solution. The most desperate women committed what was called self-divorce. They simply declared themselves no longer married and lived as if single. This had no legal validity whatsoever. They were still married in the eyes of the law. If they formed relationships with other men, they could be prosecuted for adultery. Their children from these relationships were legally illegitimate. But for some women, anything were better than staying with a violent or unbearable husband. And then there were women who stayed but found quiet ways to resist. They gave their husbands minimal compliance. They created spaces of independence within the home. They formed strong relationships with other women that provided emotional support and practical help. They survived day by day until their husbands died and they finally gained freedom as widows. This survival strategy should not be romanticized. It was not empowerment. It was endurance in the face of impossible circumstances. But it was what many women had to do. As the 1800s progressed, divorce laws slowly liberalized in some states. More grounds for divorce were recognized. Women's property rights improved slightly, making it financially more feasible for some women to leave marriages. Social attitudes shifted gradually, with divorce becoming less scandalous, though still heavily stigmatized. But progress was agonizingly slow, and for every step forward, there was resistance. Men who benefited from the system fought to maintain it. Religious leaders preached that divorce violated sacred vows. Conservative women who had found security in traditional marriage felt threatened by the women who wanted to leave theirs. What allowed this system to persist for so long? Why did society accept that women should be legally trapped in marriages with no protection from violence or exploitation, with almost no avenue of escape? The answer brings us back to ideology. The whole system rested on the idea that men and women occupied separate spheres, with men in the public world and women in the private home. And within that private sphere, within the home, the husband was absolute authority. His rule was not to be questioned by outside forces like courts or police. That would violate the sanctity of the family. But this separation of spheres was never equal, as we have been exploring throughout this journey. The private sphere was not a protected sanctuary for women. It was a place where they were isolated, controlled and often endangered, with the law looking the other way. And the ideology that kept women confined to that sphere, the ideology that said their proper place was only in the home, serving only their families, was about to face its most powerful challenge yet. What if I told you that in early 1800s America, a woman could literally be called a prostitute simply for appearing in public too much? Not for selling sex, not for dressing provocatively, just for being visible outside her home. The term public woman originally meant prostitute, and the underlying assumption was revealing. Respectable women belonged in private spaces. Home, church, perhaps a neighbour's parlour for a social call, but the streets, the marketplaces, the halls of government, the offices of business, those were male territories. A woman who ventured into public space too freely, too confidently, was transgressing a boundary as real as any physical wall. This was the doctrine of separate spheres, and it controlled where women could go, what they could do, and ultimately who they could be. Let me show you exactly how this geographic and social imprisonment worked. The ideology was elegant in its simplicity. Men occupied the public sphere: business, politics, law, commerce, anything that happened outside the home, and dealt with the competitive, harsh realities of the world. Women occupied the private sphere: home, family, children, religion, social relationships within a carefully circumscribed circle. And these were not just different roles, they were presented as fundamentally different natures. Men were naturally suited for the public sphere because they were rational, competitive, strong, capable of handling moral complexity and difficult decisions. Women were naturally suited for the private sphere because they were emotional, nurturing, pure, and needed protection from the corrupting influences of public life. A popular 1847 advice book states, "Man's sphere is the world. His energies are spent in the struggle for advancement, in the competition of business, in the rough contact with his fellow men." Woman's sphere is the home. Her energies are spent in creating order, peace, and moral beauty within her domestic sanctuary. To ask a woman to enter man's sphere is to expose her delicate nature to influences that will coarsen and corrupt her. Notice the language. Woman's sphere is not described as lesser, but as different and complementary. She is creating something sacred, a haven from the harsh world. This made the ideology more palatable. Women were not being degraded, they were being elevated to guardians of morality and civilization itself. But here is what that actually meant in practice. Women could not vote. Why? Because voting was a public political act, and politics was part of the male sphere. Women's purity would be corrupted by exposure to the rough partisan debates of politics, or alternatively, women were too pure for politics and their involvement would somehow sully the political process. The reasoning flipped depending on what was convenient, but the conclusion was always the same. Women should not vote. Women could not hold public office. A woman as mayor, as governor, as president. Unthinkable, not because women were incapable, though many people genuinely believed that, but because public office was by definition part of the public sphere, and women's presence there would violate natural order. Women could not serve on juries in most states. Why? Because jury duty required leaving home, sitting in a courtroom, hearing testimony about crimes that might include sexual violence or other indelicate matters. This would expose women to corrupting knowledge and remove them from their proper sphere. This restriction persisted shockingly late. Women were not allowed to serve on juries in all 50 states until 1975. 1975. Many of your parents or grandparents were alive when women finally won the right to participate in this basic civic duty in every state. Women could not attend most colleges or universities. We touched on this earlier when discussing education, but it is worth reiterating here. Higher education was preparation for public life, for professions, for participation in the world of commerce and ideas. Since women's sphere was the home, they did not need higher education. It would only make them dissatisfied with their proper role. Women could not enter most professions. Law? No. That was public advocacy and courtroom appearances. Medicine? Well, maybe midwifery, because that was an extension of women's natural nurturing role, but not real medicine with its public credibility and authority. Ministry? Absolutely not. Business? Only in very limited ways, and usually only when widowed or unmarried. The only profession considered truly appropriate for women was teaching, and even that came with restrictions. Women could teach young children, because that was an extension of motherhood. But teaching older students, especially boys, was questionable. And of course, women teachers were paid far less than male teachers, typically half or even a third of male salaries. Now here is where the separate spheres ideology becomes particularly insidious. It created a situation where women's confinement to the private sphere was used as evidence that they were naturally suited only for the private sphere. Women do not participate in politics. See, they are not interested in politics. Women do not run businesses. See, they lack business sense. Women do not become scientists or inventors. See, they are not intellectually suited for such work. The ideology created the conditions that prevented women from entering public life, and then pointed to women's absence from public life as proof that the ideology was correct. It was circular reasoning, but it was remarkably effective. Let me tell you about the physical reality of this geographic separation, because it had real consequences for women's daily lives and their isolation. Women in cities had some mobility. They could walk to shops, attend church, make social calls on other women, but they were expected to be accompanied either by a male relative, another woman, or a servant. A respectable woman did not walk alone in public, except for very short distances in her own neighborhood. Why? Because unaccompanied women were vulnerable to insult and harassment, and also because a woman alone might be mistaken for a prostitute. The presence of a companion signaled respectability. Women in rural areas faced different but equally constraining isolation. A farm wife might live miles from her nearest neighbour. She might go weeks or months seeing no one except her own family. The loneliness was crushing. Letters and diaries from farm women in the 1800s frequently mention the desperate isolation. One woman in Iowa in 1856 wrote, "I have not spoken to another woman in 6 weeks. My husband goes to town, sees people, hears news. I remain here with the children and see nothing but these 4 walls and the endless prairie. Some days I fear I will forget how to hold a conversation." Another diary entry from a woman in rural Ohio in 1848. "The snow has been so deep for 3 weeks that we cannot leave the house. I am going mad with the sameness of every day, cooking, cleaning, tending children with not another soul to talk to. My husband does not understand why I weep. He says I have everything I need, but I need more than food and shelter. I need companionship, conversation, some connection to the wider world." This isolation was not accidental. It was a feature of the system, not a bug. Women confined to individual homes could not organize. They could not share grievances. They could not develop collective consciousness about their situation. Each woman thought her unhappiness was personal failure, not systemic injustice. But here is what the separate spheres ideology could not fully control. Women did find ways to create community within the constraints. Church was one acceptable public space for women, and women used it. They attended services, of course, but they also organized church socials, charity work, missionary societies. These activities were acceptable because they were extensions of women's moral and nurturing nature. But within these acceptable spaces, women created networks. They talked to each other. They shared experiences. They organized collective action around causes like temperance and abolition. They learned organizing skills, public speaking, fundraising. The temperance movement is a perfect example. Alcohol abuse by men was a serious problem that directly affected women. A husband who drank heavily might spend all the family money on alcohol, might become violent, might neglect his work and family. But women could not divorce him, could not take legal control of finances, could not even refuse him access to household funds. So women organised temperance societies. They argued that protecting the home and family from alcohol's destructive influence was part of women's proper sphere. Who better to advocate for temperance than the wives and mothers who suffered most from men's drinking? This was brilliant strategy. Women took the ideology of separate spheres and used it to justify public activism. They were not leaving their sphere, they were protecting it. And in the process, they learned how to organise, petition, march, and demand change. The abolition movement worked similarly. Slavery was a moral evil, and who better to speak against moral evil than women, who were supposedly the moral superiors of society? Anti-slavery work was an extension of women's moral influence. But here is what happened. Women who became active in temperance or abolition started asking dangerous questions. If we can organise politically around these issues, why can we not vote? If our moral voice is so important, why is it not heard in government? If we can speak publicly about slavery, why can we not speak publicly about our own lack of rights? The connections became obvious, and this is how the women's rights movement was born, directly out of women's activism in other reform movements. But there was fierce resistance to women stepping outside their sphere, even for morally acceptable causes. Let me tell you about what happened when women tried to speak publicly about abolition. In 1837, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, sisters from a South Carolina slaveholding family who had become abolitionists, began speaking publicly about slavery. They spoke to mixed audiences of men and women, which was scandalous enough. But more than that, they spoke with authority, with passion, with intellectual rigour. Church leaders were appalled. The Congregational Ministers of Massachusetts issued a pastoral letter that year explicitly condemning women's public speaking. The letter stated, "When a woman assumes the place and tone of a man as a public reformer, her character becomes unnatural. If the vine, whose strength and beauty is to lean upon the trellis work and half conceal its clusters, thinks to assume the independence and overshadowing nature of the elm, it will not only cease to bear fruit, but fall in shame and dishonour into the dust." Let me translate that florid Victorian language. Women who speak publicly are unnatural. They will fail and be disgraced. Stay on your trellis, remain decorative and dependent, or you will be destroyed. But the Grimke sisters and other women abolitionists did not stop. They continued speaking. They published writings defending women's right to speak on moral issues. They made explicit connections between the enslavement of black people and the legal subordination of women. Sarah Grimke wrote in 1838, "I ask no favours for my sex. I surrender not our claim to equality. All I ask of our brethren is that they will take their feet from off our necks and permit us to stand upright on that ground which God designed us to occupy." This was revolutionary language, not asking for protection within the separate sphere, but demanding equality outside it. Now, let me address something important. The separate spheres ideology affected different women differently, and this is crucial to understand. For wealthy white women, the private sphere could be genuinely comfortable. They had servants to do the hard physical labour. They had material comfort. They had social status. The loss of public political power was real, but their daily lives were not desperate. For poor white women and immigrant women, the separate spheres ideology was a cruel joke. They had to work outside the home for economic survival. They worked in factories as domestic servants, taking in laundry. But they were still judged by the middle-class standards that said respectable women stayed home. so they were considered less respectable, less feminine, simply because they had to earn money. For enslaved women, the ideology did not apply at all. They were forced to do field labour, the hardest and most public work imaginable. They had no private sphere to retreat to. Their bodies, their labour, their children, all were subject to their enslavers' control. And then, the ideology that said women were delicate and needed protection was used to explain why enslaved women were different, less than, not really women in the way white women were. For free black women, the situation was again different. They were often forced into public work as a matter of survival, but they were also held to standards of respectability that required conforming to separate spheres' ideology to prove their worthiness. It was an impossible position, and for women on the Western frontier, the separate spheres ideology had to be adapted because survival required women to do work that was traditionally male. Women on homesteads had to handle weapons, manage livestock, make crucial business decisions when their husbands were away or incapacitated. The harsh realities of frontier life did not allow for delicate domesticity. Interestingly, this is partly why women gained voting rights earlier in Western states. Wyoming granted women's suffrage in 1869, Utah in 1870, Colorado in 1893. These were places where women had proven themselves capable in public, practical ways that Eastern ideology could not explain away. But even as some women pushed boundaries and created cracks in the separate spheres ideology, the doctrine remained powerful. It was taught in schools, preached in churches, assumed in law, reinforced in literature and popular culture. Magazine stories showed happy wives contentedly managing their homes. Novels portrayed women who tried to enter public life as either comic failures or tragic figures who learned to appreciate their proper sphere. Advice books constantly reminded women that their true power lay in their moral influence within the home, not in seeking false equality in the public world. And here is the cruelest part of all. Many women believed it. They'd been raised in this ideology, taught it from birth, seen it modelled by their mothers and grandmothers. They genuinely believed that their nature suited them only for domestic life, that wanting more was selfish or unnatural. The ideology was so successful that women policed each other. Women who stepped outside the bounds were criticised not just by men but by other women who saw them as threatening the entire structure that gave women whatever limited status and protection they had. But cracks were appearing. Education was spreading. Women were reading, thinking, questioning. Economic changes were creating new opportunities for work outside the home. The Civil War would soon force massive disruption of traditional gender roles as women took over farms and businesses and nursing and other work while men fought. The separate spheres could not hold forever. But the question was, what would replace them? And could women organise effectively enough to claim a role in shaping that new world? The answer would come through a movement that started small, but grew into one of the most significant struggles in American history. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You wake up hungry and decide you want scrambled eggs and toast for breakfast. But to make that simple meal, you must first go outside in the dark, reach under an angry hen to steal her eggs while she pecks at your hands, milk a cow by hand, churn butter for an hour until your arms ache, grind grain into flour, build a fire from scratch, monitor that fire for the next 2 hours while you mix and knead dough, let it rise, bake it in an oven with no temperature control, and then finally, after about 4 hours of labour, you can eat your breakfast. That was cooking in early 1800s America, and that was just breakfast, the simplest meal of the day. Let me take you into the kitchen, the actual heart of a woman's daily existence, and show you exactly what it meant to prepare food when there was no such thing as convenience. Because this labour was invisible, uncounted, and absolutely essential to survival. First, understand that there were no grocery stores as we know them, no refrigerators, no canned goods for most of the early 1800s, no pre-packaged anything, no measuring cups or thermometers, no timers, no recipes written in precise measurements. Everything a family ate had to be procured, processed, preserved, and prepared entirely by hand. And the responsibility for all of this fell almost entirely on women. Let me start with the most basic element: fire. Because without fire there was no cooking, and managing fire was a specialized skill that took years to master and constant attention to maintain. A woman's day began with fire, as we have discussed, but cooking fire was different from heating fire. It had to be the right temperature, maintained at that temperature for hours, adjusted constantly based on what was being cooked. Open hearth cooking, which was the standard in the early 1800s, meant cooking directly over or next to an open fire in a fireplace. Some wealthier families had cast iron stoves by the 1830s and 40s, which were somewhat easier to control but still required constant fire management. Imagine trying to bake bread when you cannot set your oven to 350 degrees and walk away. Instead, you build up the fire to what you judge is the right temperature. You test it by holding your hand inside the oven opening and counting how many seconds you can stand the heat. 5 seconds, good for bread. 3 seconds, too hot, you need to let it cool or the bread will burn on the outside and stay raw inside. And you have to maintain that temperature manually for the entire baking time, which could be an hour or more. Adding wood, adjusting the coals, opening or closing the oven door. All by judgment and experience. One woman's cookbook from 1845 gives this instruction for baking bread. The oven is properly heated when you can hold your hand within for the count of 20 without discomfort. Place the loaves within and watch carefully, turning them as needed to ensure even browning. The bread is done when it sounds hollow when tapped. Notice what is missing. Any specific temperature, any specific time, everything is judgment and experience. Now let us talk about ingredients, starting with the most basic, flour. In the early 1800s, many families grew their own grain or purchased it whole. This meant the grain had to be ground into flour. Some families had access to a mill and could take their grain to be professionally ground, though this cost money. Others ground grain at home using a hand mill or mortar and pestle. Have you ever tried to grind grain by the hand? It is exhausting. Producing enough flour for a single loaf of bread could take an hour of steady grinding, and a family of 6 or 8 might eat 2 or 3 loaves per week. Flour could go bad, get infested with weevils, or become mouldy if not stored properly. Women had to monitor stored flour constantly, sift it before use to remove any insects or debris, and use it quickly enough that it did not spoil. Yeast for bread was not something you bought in neat little packets. Women maintained sourdough starters, which were living cultures of wild yeast that had to be fed regularly with flour and water. If your starter died, you had to get a fresh starter from a neighbour, or begin the long process of cultivating wild yeast from the air. One household manual from 1833 instructs, "A good housewife maintains her yeast starter with the same care she gives to her children. Feed it every 3 days, keep it neither too warm nor too cold, and it will provide leavening for years." Maintaining a sourdough starter is actually quite finicky. Too warm and it over-ferments and dies, too cold and it goes dormant. The wrong ratio of flour to water and it develops off flavours or harmful bacteria. Women develop deep expertise in this one small aspect of cooking passed down mother to daughter. Now let us talk about acquiring the other basic ingredients: milk, butter, eggs, meat. If a family kept livestock, which most rural families did, the women usually did the milking. Cows had to be milked twice daily, every single day, at roughly the same times. You could not sleep in or take a day off. The cow needed milking whether you were sick, exhausted, or had just given birth yourself. Milking by hand takes skill and time. An experienced milker could milk a cow in 15 to 20 minutes. A beginner might take an hour and get less milk because the cow objected to rough handling, and this happened twice every day, year after year. The milk then had to be processed. Some would be kept for drinking, but it would only last a day or two before spoiling since there was no refrigeration. The rest was made into butter or cheese, both labour-intensive processes. Making butter meant pouring cream into a butter churn and agitating it for anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours until the fat separated from the buttermilk. This was monotonous, physically tiring work. Women often did it while supervising children or doing other tasks simultaneously. Making cheese was even more complex, requiring precise timing and temperature control without modern tools. Different cheeses required different techniques, different aging times, different storage conditions. A skilled cheesemaker was highly valued in her community. Eggs came from chickens, which meant maintaining a chicken coop, feeding chickens, protecting them from predators, collecting eggs daily. Hens do not lay eggs at a consistent rate. They lay more in spring and summer, less in fall and winter. So women had to preserve eggs during abundant times for use during scarce times. One preservation method was coating eggs in lard or beeswax and storing them in a cool cellar. Another was packing them in salt or wood ash. These methods worked with varying success. Preserved eggs often developed off flavours, but they were better than no eggs at all during winter. Meat was perhaps the most challenging ingredient to manage. There was no refrigeration, remember, so when an animal was slaughtered, the meat had to be processed and preserved immediately or it would rot. Slaughtering was usually done by men, but women did all the processing. This meant cutting up the carcass, rendering fat for lard, making sausage from scraps and organ meats, salting or smoking meat for preservation. Salt preservation meant covering meat in salt and storing it in barrels. This kept it from rotting but made it incredibly salty. Before cooking salted meat, you had to soak it in multiple changes of water to remove excess salt, which took hours. Smoking meat required building and maintaining a smokehouse, keeping a low, steady smoke going for days or weeks. The meat hung in the smoke, slowly drying and taking on preservative compounds from the wood smoke. And during slaughter time, usually late fall, women worked frantically to process everything before it spoiled. One account from an Indiana farm wife in 1856 describes slaughtering 2 pigs. We worked from before dawn until long after dark for 3 days, rendering lard, making sausage, salting hams, preparing every bit of the animals for use or preservation. My hands were raw, my back ached terribly, and the smell of blood and fat permeated everything. But it had to be done, for this meat must feed us through the winter. Vegetables and fruits presented similar challenges. Whatever grew in the garden or orchard had to be preserved at harvest time or it would be lost. This meant pickling, drying, making preserves and jams, storing root vegetables in cellars. Pickling required vinegar, salt, spices, and careful technique. Jams required sugar, which was expensive, and hours of stirring over a hot fire. Drying fruits and vegetables required spread them in the sun and protecting them from insects and animals. All of this preservation work happened in late summer and fall, when women were already working full-time on regular cooking and household tasks. Harvest season meant 18-hour days for weeks on end, racing to preserve food before it spoiled. Now, let us walk through preparing an actual meal, say a typical dinner for a family of 6 in 1830. The meal might consist of a meat stew, bread, vegetables, and perhaps a pie for dessert. Let me break down what each component required. For the stew, take salted pork from the barrel, soak it for several hours to remove salt. While it soaks, go to the root cellar and bring up potatoes, carrots, onions. These are covered in dirt and must be scrubbed clean. Peel them with a knife as there are no vegetable peelers. Cut them into chunks. Build up the fire and hang an iron pot over it. Add water hauled from the well. Add the meat and vegetables. Add herbs dried from the summer garden. Monitor the fire to keep it at a simmer, not a boil. Stir occasionally. This takes several hours. For the bread, check your sourdough starter. Has it been fed recently? Feed it with flour and water if needed. Wait for it to bubble. Mix dough using flour, water, salt and starter. Knead it for 10 to 15 minutes until smooth. Let it rise for several hours. Punch it down, shape into loaves, let rise again. Meanwhile, build up the fire in your oven, test the temperature, adjust as needed. Bake for about an hour, checking frequently to prevent burning. For the vegetables, perhaps you're serving greens from the garden. Pick them fresh, wash them multiple times to remove dirt and insects. Chop them, cook them in a pot with a bit of the salted pork fat for flavouring. For the pie, make pastry dough from flour, lard and cold water. Roll it out on a floured board using a heavy bottle or rolling pin. Line a pie pan, fill with fruit that you dried last summer and rehydrated, sweetened with precious sugar or molasses. Cover with top crust. Bake in the temperamental oven alongside the bread, hoping both come out properly. Notice how everything requires multiple steps, specialized knowledge, constant attention, and physical labor, and this is just one meal. Women cooked 3 meals per day every single day for their entire adult lives. There was no ordering takeout when you were too tired. No opening a can of soup when someone was sick. No running to the store for prepared food. If you did not cook, your family did not eat. And the meals had to be appropriate to the family's social status. This was a matter of pride and social standing. A family that served plain, rough food constantly was judged as poor or slovenly. A woman who could not produce good meals was considered a failure as a wife. Dining habits in middle-class and upper-class families were formal and structured. Meals were served at set times. Table manners were strict. Children were expected to behave properly. The whole performance reflected on the wife's management skills. One etiquette book from 1845 devotes an entire chapter to proper table service and states, "The character of a household is revealed in its table. A well-ordered meal served punctually with well-prepared food and proper manners observed indicates a well-ordered home and a capable wife. Chaos at table suggests chaos in all other domestic arrangements." Can you imagine that pressure? You've worked for hours in a hot kitchen, your hands are burned from the fire, you're exhausted, and now you must serve the meal perfectly and maintain pleasant conversation while your husband and children eat. And if anything is wrong with the food or the service, it reflects poorly on your worth as a woman. For special occasions, the pressure intensified. Sunday dinner after church was a major meal, often with extended family or guests. Holiday meals required elaborate preparations. Weddings, christenings, funerals all required feeding large groups. Women spent days preparing for these events, baking pies and cakes, roasting meats, making multiple side dishes. Everything had to be fresh, as leftovers could not be safely stored for long. And here is something that might surprise you. Despite all this labour, despite the skill and knowledge required, despite the fact that families' health and survival depended on women's cooking, this work was completely unvalued economically. A husband could complain about the quality of meals, a mother-in-law could criticise, church ladies could judge, but no one suggested that a woman should be paid for this labour, or that it had economic value. It was just what women did, natural, expected, invisible. The irony is sharp. Men's work outside the home, whether farming or trade or business, was valued and compensated. But women's work inside the home, equally essential and arguably more skilled in many cases, counted for nothing in economic terms. I want to be clear about class differences here, because not all women experienced cooking the same way. Wealthy women had servants who did most of the actual cooking, but they were expected to manage the servants, plan menus, oversee the kitchen, ensure meals were properly prepared and served. This was considered a full-time job in itself. Poor women and enslaved women did the hardest cooking labor. They cooked for their own families and often for employers or enslavers as well. They worked in the most primitive conditions with the fewest resources, and they received the least recognition and the lowest compensation, if any. But across all classes, the expectation was that women were responsible for feeding their families. It was their domain, their duty, and their burden. As the 1800s progressed, some changes began to ease cooking labor. Cast iron stoves became more common and more affordable, offering better heat control than open hearths. The canning process was developed in the mid-1800s, allowing food to be preserved more safely and easily. Commercial food production began slowly, with some goods available for purchase rather than home production. But these changes came slowly and were often expensive, available only to families with resources. For most women in early 1800s America, cooking remained a labor-intensive, time-consuming, skilled craft that they performed without recognition, compensation, or relief. Every meal was a test. Every preserved food was an investment in winter survival. Every loaf of bread was evidence of competence or failure. The kitchen was simultaneously a woman's domain and her prison, a place where she exercised creativity and skill while being bound by necessity and duty. And through all of this labor, through all of these different forms of constraint and suffering we have explored throughout this journey, women survived. They persisted. They found meaning and joy where they could. They supported each other. They passed knowledge to their daughters. They endured. But endurance alone was not enough. The question that eventually emerged from all this suffering was simple and profound. Why? Why should life be this way? And what could be done to change it? There is a moment in every oppressive system when the oppressed stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "Why us?" When individual suffering transforms into collective consciousness, when endurance becomes resistance. For American women, that moment came gradually, built from countless small rebellions and quiet refusals, from whispered conversations and forbidden thoughts, until finally it erupted into open demand for change. And the place where it all came together, where the individual threads of women's suffering were woven into a movement, was a small chapel in Seneca Falls, New York, in the summer of 1848. Let me take you there, but first let me show you how we arrived at that moment. Remember everything we have discussed: the legal erasure under coverture, the brutal physical labor, the endless laundry, the deadly childbirth, the restrictive ideology of true womanhood, the denial of education, the medical horrors, the economic dependency, the marriage trap, the geographic imprisonment of separate spheres, the invisible labor of cooking and household management. Each of these was a separate cage, but together they formed a prison so complete that escape seemed impossible. And yet, women were finding the keys. Education was one key. Despite all the barriers, despite all the warnings that education would damage women's health or make them unmarriageable, women were learning. The female seminaries we discussed earlier were producing graduates who could read, write, think critically, and articulate arguments. These educated women read the Declaration of Independence and noticed that it said, "All men are created equal," but made no mention of women. They read philosophy about natural rights and asked why those rights did not extend to them. They studied history and saw that women's subordination was not universal or eternal, but varied across cultures and time periods, which meant it could change. Work outside the home was another key. As the Industrial Revolution progressed, more women worked in factories, in shops, as teachers and writers. This gave them a glimpse of economic independence, limited as it was. It showed them they were capable of work beyond the domestic sphere. And crucially, it brought women together outside their isolated homes, where they could talk, share experiences, develop solidarity. The reform movements were perhaps the most important key. Women who joined the temperance movement to fight alcohol abuse learned how to organize meetings, circulate petitions, give speeches, manage finances. Women who joined the abolition movement to fight slavery learned how to argue moral positions publicly, how to face down critics, how to persist in the face of opposition. And within the abolition movement, women encountered a particularly stark hypocrisy. They were fighting to free enslaved people from bondage while they themselves lived under legal and social bondage. Black women abolitionists like Sojourner Truth pointed out this parallel explicitly. In 1851, Sojourner Truth gave her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech at a women's rights convention in Ohio. She said, "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have ploughed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?" Her words cut through the ideology of feminine delicacy and exposed it as a lie that applied only to some women, and even then only superficially. She had done men's work, endured men's punishments, and survived horrors that would have broken most people. The ideology that said women were too weak for public life was revealed as nonsense. White women abolitionists working alongside black women began to see their own situation more clearly. If enslaved people deserved freedom from bondage, did not women deserve freedom from legal subordination? If it was wrong for one human to own another, was it not also wrong for a husband to own his wife's earnings, property, and even her body? These questions became impossible to ignore, and in 1848, a group of women decided to act. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized a women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. They placed a notice in the local newspaper announcing a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of woman. About 300 people attended, including about 40 men. The convention produced a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, deliberately modelled on the Declaration of Independence. It began, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." Then it listed grievances, just as the Declaration of Independence had listed grievances against King George. But these grievances were against men's systematic oppression of women. Let me read you some of them, because they summarize everything we have explored in this journey. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. He has made her, if married in the eye of the law, civilly dead. He has taken from her all right in property, even to the wages she earns. He has so framed the laws of divorce as to what shall be the proper causes, and in case of separation, to whom the guardianship of the children shall be given, as to be wholly regardless of the happiness of women. He has monopolized nearly all the profitable employments, and from those she is permitted to follow she receives but a scanty remuneration. He has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed against her. He has created a false public sentiment by giving to the world a different code of morals for men and women. Every single one of these grievances reflects the realities we have discussed: legal invisibility, economic dependency, the marriage trap, limited education, double standards, the systematic subordination of women in every aspect of life. The Declaration of Sentiments demanded sweeping changes: the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to equal education, the right to enter professions, the right to speak publicly, the right to participate in religious institutions on equal terms with men. And here is what is remarkable: this was not a small radical fringe. Yes, many people mocked the convention. Newspapers called the women unnatural, ridiculous, dangerous. Critics said they were trying to destroy the family and society itself. But the convention happened. The declaration was published. The movement had begun. In the years following Seneca Falls, women's rights conventions were held regularly in different cities. Women organized, petitioned state legislatures, published newspapers and pamphlets, gave speeches despite ridicule and sometimes physical threats. Susan B. Anthony, who became one of the movement's most famous leaders, began her activism in the 1850s. She traveled constantly, organizing women, giving speeches, lobbying lawmakers. She faced hostile audiences, had rotten eggs and vegetables thrown at her, was called every insult imaginable. She persisted. Lucy Stone was another powerful voice. She kept her own name when she married, refusing to become Mrs. Henry Blackwell, a radical act that spawned the term Lucy Stoner for women who kept their birth names. She was an eloquent speaker who could hold audiences spellbound. These women and countless others whose names we do not know built a movement. They connected women's legal subordination to broader questions of human rights and justice. They made arguments that could not be easily dismissed. And slowly, painfully slowly, things began to change. We have already discussed the Married Women's Property Acts that began in 1839. These were not won through altruism but through women's relentless advocacy. Every state that passed such laws did so because women organized, petitioned, lobbied, and refused to be silent. Access to higher education expanded. Oberlin College admitted women in 1837. Women's colleges like Vassar, Smith and Wellesley were founded in the 1860s and 70s. Medical schools began admitting women. Law schools followed. By the late 1800s, there were female doctors, lawyers, ministers, professors, though still in small numbers and facing enormous prejudice. Divorce laws slowly liberalized in most states. More grounds for divorce were recognized. Women's rights to their children improved, though fathers still had presumptive custody in most places. Employment opportunities expanded. The typewriter was invented in the 1860s, and companies began hiring women as typists and stenographers. Teaching became an increasingly feminized profession. Women entered retail, nursing work, but the vote remained elusive. That was the ultimate symbol of citizenship and full participation in society, and it was fiercely contested. The women's suffrage movement would continue for 72 years after Seneca Falls before the 19th Amendment to the Constitution guaranteed women the right to vote in 1920. 72 years. 3 generations of women fought for something we now take for granted. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony died before seeing women win the vote. They fought their entire adult lives for a right they never personally exercised, but they knew they were planting seeds for future harvests. Stanton wrote in 1855, "We may not live to see the day when women stand equal with men before the law, but we can work to hasten that day. Every petition signed, every speech given, every woman who refuses to accept subordination brings that day closer." And here is what moves me most about this story. The women's rights movement was built by women who were suffering under the very constraints they fought to end. They organized conventions while managing households without modern conveniences. They wrote petitions while caring for children and doing laundry by hand. They gave speeches while corseted so tightly they could barely breathe, because to appear in public without proper dress would discredit their message. They fought for education while being told education would damage their health. They demanded economic rights while having no economic resources of their own. They called for the vote while being mocked as unnatural and unwomanly. The courage that required is almost impossible to comprehend. They had no guarantee of success. They faced ridicule, ostracism, sometimes violence. They knew they might not live to see the changes they fought for, and they did it anyway, because they understood something profound. The individual suffering they experienced was not personal failure, but systemic injustice. The exhaustion, the legal erasure, the economic dependency, the physical danger, the intellectual stifling, all of it was not natural or inevitable, but constructed by human law and custom and therefore changeable by human effort. And they also understood that their fight was not just for themselves, but for all women who would come after, for their daughters and granddaughters, for women not yet born who would inherit whatever world they managed to create. Now, here in 2025, we live in that future they fought for. We can vote, we can own property, we can enter any profession, we can divorce abusive husbands, we can keep our own names, we can control our own money. We have access to education, to birth control, to legal protection. None of this happened by accident. None of it was given freely. Every right we have was fought for by women who lived under constraints we can barely imagine, and their work is not finished. Women still face wage gaps, glass ceilings, disproportionate domestic labour, violence, discrimination. The specifics have changed, but the struggle for genuine equality continues. But we have tools they did not have. We have the vote. We have economic independence. We have education. We have the legal right to participate fully in public life. We have the foundation they built for us. What we do with that inheritance matters. Do we recognize how hard won these rights are? Do we use our freedoms not just for ourselves, but to continue expanding justice for all women, especially those still facing barriers? The women of early 1800s America could not have imagined our world. They would be astonished by washing machines and dishwashers, by grocery stores and restaurants, by women presidents of universities and companies, and maybe someday of the nation itself. They would be amazed by women athletes and scientists and artists and leaders. But they would not be surprised that women are capable of these things. They always knew women were capable. They just had to fight for the world to recognize it. So as we end this journey through the home life of women in early 1800s America, I want you to remember something. Those women, hauling water in the darkness before dawn, enduring deadly childbirth, trapped in loveless marriages, working until their bodies broke, legally invisible, economically powerless. They were not victims. They were survivors. They were fighters. They were revolutionaries who changed the world while cooking dinner and washing clothes and raising children. They deserve to be remembered. Their suffering deserves to be acknowledged. Their courage deserves to be celebrated, and their incomplete revolution deserves to be continued. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for listening to these stories, for bearing witness to this history. I hope you will carry these women's memories with you, honor their struggles, and recognize that the freedoms we enjoy came at enormous cost. If this story moved you, if you learned something, if you feel connected to these women across the centuries, please share this video. Leave a comment telling me what struck you most powerfully, and subscribe to this channel, because there are so many more stories to tell, so many more voices to lift up from history. Sleep well, friends. And when you wake in the morning, perhaps take a moment to think of a woman in 1825 rising in the darkness, building a fire, hauling water, beginning another day of invisible labor. She lived, she mattered, and her story has now been told. Until we meet again for another journey through history, good night.